Committee Room 29, signed. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
It's us. If I could just get the thumbs up when we're good to go. Okay, so that is us in open session. So just remind members, the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. And for anyone in the public gallery, but they're not here yet, but if anybody's listening, you're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and devices are muted. You can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi and password details are available on the gallery rules. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. So that brings us to item 1 on the agenda, and I would just highlight at the start and we'll maybe come to this as we go through the agenda, despite our agreement at the strategic planning day to look at lighter agendas to give us more time for questions and answer. We have got a fairly heavy agenda today, but we will be looking to address that going forward. So we are going to try and move through any parts of the agenda that we can get through quickly. We will do so. So item 1 is apologies, of which there are none, so we can move on to item 2, Chairperson's business. I would really just briefly ask members to note a record of the informal meeting that we had with St Mary's Primary School, 5 Mile Town, on the 30th of April on page 5, and members may want to refer to that when we have DE officials in later in relation to area planning. We also had another informal meeting with the Farmers for Action rural schools groups, and they were seeking a reversal of rural school closure decisions, and they wanted to raise a number of issues around the sustainable schools policy. A briefing note of that will be provided next week for members. Item 3 is declaration. Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just before you go off it. In regards to groups that do lobby the committee for hearing about to get an informal session as opposed to coming to a formal session, have we got something we can share in terms of how that decision is made, if that's okay? Or something quite public which will help people understand the difference in the two and how we do try and facilitate in that informal session.
The difference between a formal and an informal briefing?
If that's okay, yeah.
I have no issue
just
with
even
that.
if we can publish it somewhere, it would be useful.
Clark, are you able to take that forward? And then obviously at forward work planning is when we make those decisions, so it is for all members to feed into that, whether they think the formal or informal briefing is more appropriate.
Certainly, that's broadly it. You guys decide. So, but yeah, I'll write you something.
But yeah, if it's helpful to establish what the difference, perhaps for the public's benefit in those two briefings. Item 3 is declarations of interest. I would just want to, given the presentations we have today, I would just want to declare my wife is a teacher in a grant-maintained integrated primary school, and I have a child in a grant-maintained integrated post-primary school, so I should just put that on record. Are there any other declarations of interest?
Thank you, Chair. I'm on the Board of Governors of integrated primary school.
That is us then. So moving on to item 4, which is matters arising. So at the last committee meeting, much of it was in closed session as it was a strategic planning session, but the committee did receive an oral briefing from Forest Schools NI, and we had agreed we would consider any actions arising from that. I understand through the clerk that the Forest Schools Association are looking to actually submit a further written briefing on areas they would like to see follow-up from the committee on. And we've also, at item 6, you'll see there are other items that might be coming forward from the strategic planning session. So I'm just going to propose that we carry any actions arising from that briefing over to next week, if that's okay for members. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Item 5 is draft minutes. So I would refer members to the draft minutes of the committee meeting of the 1st of May 2024, and that's at page 3 of your tabled papers. So I would propose that those are a complete and accurate record of proceedings. Are members agreed?
Good.
Okay, let me just get a signature on those. And then that takes us to item 6. So that was the outcome of the strategic planning meeting, which was held last week and hosted by the Forest Schools Association at the Clandyboy Estate. So I think I just want to put on record in this session our appreciation for the hospitality last week. It was a fantastic setting and really, really good to get out and see the outdoor education happening live. It was really, really, really helpful for all of the members, and the sun shone. So it was you couldn't really have asked for better. So want to put on record our thanks to them for hosting that. But in terms of the meeting itself, there was an extensive conversation around reviewing the work of the committee to date and our future agenda and approach going forward. As I've already referenced, one issue was highlighted, which I think there was agreement across all members on, was just the volume of material coming before the committee each session. And I think there was an agreement that we maybe need to try and compress our agendas a little bit more so that we can leave better time for question and answer of witnesses. But there is going to be further material coming through from the clerk and her team on the agreements we made in relation to the scope and shape of the RSE inquiry and any other items relating to forward work planning. So I would like to suggest, rather than having a discussion about that now, given that we have a long agenda this week and potentially a lighter one next, that again we carry that summary over to next week to give it proper time and attention at next week's meeting. Members agreed?
Great.
Okay. That is great. So that moves us on, and I'm pleased to see we are making good time on this. So that brings us to item 7, which is a briefing from the Integrated Education Fund. So I would refer members to the briefing paper at page 21 from the committee clerk, and then a briefing paper supplied by the IAF at page 23 of your packs. So while you guys get settled, I just want to thank you first of all for agreeing to come a little bit earlier to committee than we had planned. It's helping us get through our agenda, so thank you for your flexibility in that regard, and thank you for giving us your time this afternoon and for reaching out to the committee to present. So, I mean, you guys can probably do more detailed introductions, but I would just like to welcome Peter Osborne, the Chairperson of the IAF, Sean Pettis, the Parental Engagement Campaign Manager at the IAF, and Paul Collins, the Head of Public Affairs and Advocacy at the IAF. You're all very welcome here. It's good to see you all again. I'll hand over to you at this stage to make an initial opening presentation. We would say of up to 10 minutes. We want to leave as much time as possible for members to engage in question and answer with yourselves. But I'll hand over to you at this stage for an initial presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. I think I'm going to start off briefly. Paul and Sean are going to be both making the more substantive points, I suspect, and answering all the hard questions, because I'm the chair of the organisation and volunteer as chair of the organisation, so they do all the work and do all the positive stuff that happens. So thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I want to say another thank you as well to MLAs and to the Assembly as a whole for what you did at the end of the last mandate, when I think you passed 2 really important bits of legislation. The FETO exemption and the Integrated Education Act. I'm sure you're all aware the FETO exemption was when it was passed, it meant that there was employment inequality rights applied within all school settings for people taking up jobs, and it was a really important piece of legislation, and we're seeing the outworking of that as we go through. And the Integrated Education Act was a really important part, a next step, I suppose, for some of the things that we certainly believe are important for this place going forward. Passing the legislation, of course, is one thing. Giving meaning to it is another, and I suspect we will come to that issue as we go through some of the discussions that we're going to have. The IAF is a charity. It's a charity that supports integrated schools, wants to work proactively, constructively with other sectors in increasing diversity within other sectors as a recommendation of the Independent Review of Education. And it's also a charity that supports work with parents to give them the opportunity to vote on whether they want a school to go integrated. And just as a reminder, over the last 5 years, the number of successful parental ballots has been, I think, 25 or 26. So over the last 4 to 5 years, every other month, parents have voted for their school to go integrated. And that reflects the demand that we're seeing in poll after poll after poll. And really, almost with one exception where it was lost by one parent in the vote, every time that parents have said, can we vote, they have voted positively. And I think that reflects parents, well, they have a number of reasons why they want to send their children to whatever school. Ultimately, if they were given the choice also, do you want that school to be integrated, they tend to vote yes. Well, they always have voted yes with one exception, which was really, really tight and narrow. When we talk about increasing diversity, we do so because we think it's a really important thing for this society going forward. We hear lots of things said about it in existing schools. The fact of the statistics coming from the department is that kids going to Catholic maintained schools, 1% of them are from a Protestant background, and those going to controlled schools, about 7%, slightly over, are from a Catholic background. Our schools aren't as diverse as they should be or could be. And other independent research has shown that over the last wee while as well. There hasn't been as much progress in that as we would, I hope, all like to see. And as a fund, we want to work across sectors to try and increase that diversity, because it's not an easy thing to do. I'm going to shut up in a second, but before I do, let me say, I'm not from the integrated sector. I don't have family in the integrated sector. I chair this charity because I truly believe the importance of the work that it does, and the importance for this place going forward, whatever you want to call it, and whatever your political outlook, that we have a more reconciled and cohesive society. Agree with the Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, who said last year he wants to see in the next 25 years integrated education becoming the norm rather than the exception. And I agree with the President of Ireland, Michael D, who said integrated education was critically important for this place as it develops its piece over the next number of years as well. Let me say just one final thing, and these guys will touch on it as well. The Integrated Education Act veto exemption there were really important bits of legislation. In our view, that means, though, we need to give life to it. And you guys passed the legislation. If you want to give it meaning, it needs to be given life. And the current budget set aside to implement that piece of legislation is £50,000. I say that twice because people can't believe it's as little as that. £50,000 by the department. That's not enough. That's half a salary for an associated cost in a department. So if you want to give it meaning, I think we need to really talk about the amount of money that's required to make that legislation real. But let me hand over to the guys to talk about the more substantive points.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks again for the invitation today. I'm going to say a little bit about our parental engagement campaign and just a bit about some of the ways that we've been supporting the development of integrated education. As an organisation, we very much draw our mandate from the expressed desire of parents, and Peter's mentioned some of the ways we see that through transformations, through polls, through surveys, and through people contacting us. So our role is very much about supporting parents to understand how they can access integrated education, but also working with schools so they understand that process of transformation. And we've been really quite successful in recent times. Back in 2011, there was an IPOS Mori poll, and it said that about 15% of parents understood that any school could transform, or almost any school could transform through parental ballot. And we know that that's gone up in our last Lucid survey in 2023 to about 66%. So from 15 to 66 in a matter of around 11-12 years is a fantastic increase. So as Peter said, and members will be aware, since 2019 we've had around 26 successful parental ballots. And the average yes vote there has been around about the 90% mark, and the average turnout has been around 71%. So really quite substantive majorities, both in vote and in turnout. But one of the challenges associated with that is finding a way to continue to accurately measure demand for integrated education, and we see this as the Act rolls out. Ways that are both robust and accurate. So in the IAF, we commissioned ARC in Queen's University to undertake some research into the different ways that could be used, a suite of measures that could be used to help measure demand. And in line with their findings, we think one of those really important ways is parental ballots. They're a key democratic process. Parents are given information about integrated education and then the opportunity to vote. So we would ask the committee to explore that also with the department about how parental ballots can be seen as an important way of measuring demand. However, we've also developed some other initiatives that help us explore demand. And one of those is we provided funding to Ulster University School of Education to develop the Future Schools methodology. This is the toolkit here. And Future Schools, the team at Ulster designed it in partnership with schools and with other education planners. And it's a toolkit that enables schools to think about their own sustainability and then to move to a community conversation where they think about what provision would best meet an area. And I noted earlier on, the comments around closure of rural schools and that kind of thing. And we would see the Future Schools methodology as a tool that could be used to help address how best in communities where provision is being removed, that could be replaced. And so by asking a community, by thinking about what provision would best meet the needs of children and young people, families and communities, it's a much more democratic and participative way. We would very much hope that would lead to more children being educated together, to more integrated schools. But of course, the results of those conversations would be up to those communities, with a view to planning authorities then taking forward whatever the result of that conversation would be. So we'd invite the committee perhaps to engage directly with the researchers at Ulster University who have developed that. In September, we will also have a post-primary Future Schools toolkit that will do essentially the same process but tailored to secondary level education. Future schools, I think, is particularly important given the ongoing area planning activity. And part of area planning is, of course, about reducing the overall number of schools. We believe that the independent review of education, and in line with the independent review, that area planning is probably best done outside of the current structures, and that an independent planning commission would be the best vehicle to help our education state to be aligned, to help more children and young people be educated together. So we'd also invite the committee to consider how that particular element might be taken forward in the coming time. Paul.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Collins, and I'm the Head of Public Affairs and Advocacy at the Integrated Education Fund. Let's be clear, integrated education is the heart of a reconciled society and where we really want to go to in society in Northern Ireland moving forward. I just want to draw upon my own personal experiences. My own personal experiences, as maybe many people around the table here in the committee and out throughout Northern Ireland, is going to a divided education. I went to a single-sex school. Single-sex school. I went to a Catholic primary school, largest Catholic primary school in actually in Europe, Holy Child in Ansonstown, in Smallagys, in North Belfast. This was, you came in through the gates, and one side was boys, one side was girls, and it was all Catholic. And then the same in secondary school. And I often joke about this. I don't think I met a Protestant until I was 17, and possibly not even a girl until I was 17 as well. But so that's a reality, and it's still a reality for a lot of people in Northern Ireland.
Made up for it since.
However, my daughter's experience is a million miles apart. I reflect on their current education and where they're going is a million. It's not 20, 30 years difference. It could be 2 or 3 centuries. They went to Forge Integrated Primary School. And they also went to Lagan College as well, where they've been open to all diversity, to different religions, different races, to do Irish language, to play different sports, gender, religion, nationality, academic ability. That is the reality of integrated education in Northern Ireland. I was given them a lift recently to a match, and in the car there was a Gaelgorg, a girl who was a fully Irish speaker, had gone to an Irish primary school, was now in Lagan College. There was another girl from East Belfast, it was my daughter, there was a girl from Spain, all in one car, been lifted to an event. You would not get that in many other forms of education in Northern. That's the reality of integrated education. Surely that's something to aspire to. And I think it is something we aspire to. And we saw that in, as Peter touched upon, in the Integrated Education Act Northern Ireland 2022, which was passed into law on the 26th of April 2022, was probably one of the most debated pieces of legislation that has gone through the Assembly over the last number of years. But at the end of the day, the majority of people, MLAs, voted for that, 42 to 32, and I'm sure if it was repeated again today, there'd probably be a larger margin of people supporting that act. At the core of that act is to encourage, facilitate and support integrated education. Whilst the Integrated Education Fund, we do recognise that the Department of Education, the Education for our bodies have helped to kind of move that forward in terms of a strategy and a public consultation and a report and many, many means. We are disappointed in the expectations around the Integrated Education Act. We don't really feel it is delivered for the people of Northern Ireland. And this can be demonstrated by an action plan, which within the actual Act itself, it actually had specific targets that should be put into a strategy. The number of development proposals, the number of school transformations, the number of integrated schools to be established. That is not in the final strategy. That is not in the action plan. It's a much more broader sweep. Also, just to reiterate what Peter said as well, there's a nominal £50,000 allocated in the Act to develop a strategy that we're wanting to expand into schools throughout Northern Ireland. 50,000 is a tiny drop in the ocean to go towards that there. We've also seen in the last number of weeks £150 million taken away from 10 integrated schools in a shared campus as the Assembly comes back. The growth in integrated education is being driven by parents, and that has always been the case. The whole history of the integrated movement, every single one of the 72 schools in Northern Ireland that are integrated were set up by parents, not by politicians, not by pieces of legislation. It's parents coming together. At Lagan College, when you had a small group of parents coming together and getting a scout hut from the National Trust and getting 28 pupils in there and busing people into that, right through to a parental ballot in Bangor Academy, the largest school in Northern Ireland, voted by an incredibly significant majority to become integrated. That has been driven forward by parents. And the challenge, I would say, is what is the Committee for Education and the Northern Ireland Assembly now doing to move forward to encourage, facilitate and support the Integrated Education Act, because that is in law. Thank you.
Thank you. And you pretty much nailed it in time there, so that's great. I've had a couple of indications from members. Anyone else looking to come in, do just let me know, or through the clerk if I don't catch your eye. I wanted to focus in initially just on the issue of demand, because that's come through, I think, from all of your contributions, and I think in terms of one of the key duties that's placed on the department out of the Act, monitoring and aiming to meet that demand is a really key one. You've been quite clear that you don't think that what the department is proposing is actually adequate to meet demand. Can you give us a bit more information about what you would like to see, how you would foresee demand being monitored in a way that is meaningful and that is robust and that would actually deliver on the statutory duties in the Act?
I'll start, sure. I suppose in the members, the Section 10 report of the Act that's to be laid in front of the Assembly kind of breaks down demand into two areas. The idea of societal demand, which is kind of through surveys and polls and those kind of things, and then what it calls behavioural demand, which is kind of school preference at admission time. And one of the fundamental difficulties with that approach is you cannot put a preference down for a school that doesn't exist. So whilst it helps, one way to grow integrated education is where there's oversubscription, see if there's the possibility to increase the size of the school, and that applies to any type of school. However, if you can only do that within the existing network of schools, you're always limited in scope as to how far you can go. So the idea that I would argue, given that the kind of positioning of societal demand and behavioural demand, that ballots, for example, as I mentioned earlier, should really be part of behavioural demand. That's parents with children enrolled in a school that is not integrated, who, when asked and provided with information, make a decision that they do, or don't, but in the majority of cases do, wish their school to be integrated. So one very practical way would be to consider parental ballots as a central part of a strategy to ascertain what demand is.
Let me add a couple of things to that. And those of us who have gone through the process with a child going from primary to post-primary school will understand, and it's not difficult, everybody will understand, but you know, the where you put your first, second and third preference. And I think very often in the current system, people put a first preference that actually isn't their first preference, because they're working out, if I don't put this school first, it might not, or yeah, if I put it second or third, I'll not get my son or daughter into that school. So they'll put first the school that they know they'll get in, which may not be their preferred school, but is maybe not the least preferred school, if that makes sense. And so because there is a lack of integrated options for parents, I think that skews where existing demand is. I think the other thing I would want to say is a school that votes to go integrated, it costs about £3,000 to have that ballot. It's independently done from an organisation across the water. And people very often will say, this is all about parental demand and parental choice and so on. And I would say, well, give parents the choice then. If parents in a school vote not to go integrated, that's absolutely fine. And as an organisation, we'll still support that school in how to increase its diversity. But let's give the parents the choice. It's not a huge amount of money. And I would roll it out over 10 years. And if I was the department and say, let's actually set a target, this is ambitious, of every school in Northern Ireland being given the option, by the parents, given the option of whether they vote to go integrated or not. And as I say, if they vote to stay as they are, absolutely fine. And we'll support that school regardless of the sector in whatever way we can. But it won't actually cost an awful lot of money. And the economic benefits and the social benefits are shown to be really significant for those children as they learn about diversity within the school and have friendships and so on from different backgrounds, as they leave school, as probably most of us did, with our life patterns set based on what we have learnt in school at 18, whether we've met girls or people from Protestant or Catholic background, whether we play Gaelic sports or whether we play cricket and hockey. That's a life pattern set. And so you have people leaving school live in parallel lives almost because of, and it's not a criticism of the education, everything is very positive on all sectors, but they almost live parallel lives. That's not what this place should be about. The social benefits and the economic benefits are there. And I do want to touch on isolated pairs at some point, where when you look at the departmental figures, 42%, I think it is, of rural schools are below the threshold for sustainability. That is not a school estate that is sustainable. The IEF did some independent research where they identified, I think, 32 pairs of schools, one from a maintained, one from a controlled sector, within 1 mile of each other in villages in Northern Ireland. Of those 32 pairs, 64 schools, of those 32 pairs, 26 had one or both schools below the threshold for sustainability. Now, anybody in their right mind, I think, would say, let's start proactively planning to make sure that both schools don't close, or that a village that has a mixed population is able to service that population with a school that all parents are comfortable with, and in that way you have some economic benefits to how you plan for that school estate going forward, if that makes sense. So in terms of parental demand, the current system doesn't do it because there is an inadequate provision of integrated schools, but we need a holistic approach, which I will embrace parental choice, gives them the choice in every school, and actually the money saved and the importance of the impact in local villages to ensure that schools survive is a really important social outcome as well.
Thank you for that. And for me, demand was the bit I really wanted to draw out, so I'm happy to move on to other members at this stage.
Well, I'm sorry, Chair, can I just, as Sean said, there have been independent polls after independent polls after independent polls. And over years and years and years, I'm not talking about commissioned by any organisation, I'm talking about NISRA polls and so on, which shows that if parents are given the free choice, they would prefer their child to go to an integrated school. And the polling that IEF has done, which people are just go out and do it themselves and IEF doesn't interfere, it shows actually that includes a majority of parents from all political parties. Every political party, majority of parents say we'd actually prefer integrated if we had that option.
And just
I
back
can
on
just come by. I think the key is the department don't seem to me to be putting forward anything that is deliberately or proactively asking that question of parents. I think that for me is the challenge. The assumption that the admissions process will somehow capture that doesn't seem enough, and I think we need to see proactively how the department will actually meet the requirements.
There's effectively three elements, and the department have touched on this, but I think we do need to be more proactive about it. Peter's mentioned there about isolated pairs, approximately 30 isolated pairs in Northern Ireland, 2 small schools in one village, and just not sustainable. Tiny numbers, double principals, double caretakers. I mean, there's a logic for those schools to come together and potentially become integrated, and we have seen that happen in ballots. You've then got areas in throughout Northern Ireland where there's clearly under provision. The most oversubscribed school in Northern Ireland is Lagan College. The most oversubscribed school in North Belfast is an integrated school as well. You've got Malone College as well. 3 of the most oversubscribed schools in Belfast are integrated schools. So obviously there is a demand there for more integrated provision. And then you've got areas in Belfast or Northern Ireland where there is literally no integrated schools at all. And surely there is a logic there for a school there to become integrated. If you're putting down your parental preference, my daughters go to Lagan College, but they didn't go to their nearest school because the nearest school wasn't integrated. So if you don't have an integrated school, you can't put it down as the first preference. So you're caught in this kind of vicious circle, and people keep saying, oh, well, you know, you've got this demand, but why aren't people sending more people to integrated schools? Well, if there's an integrated school in the area, you can't put it down. And the cost of going to, we're transporting people past their near schools, and parents are paying money on bus fares, taxi fares, car fares to get them to what isn't their near school as well. And also the environmental impact of that as well. If you're getting the buses and cars and you're not going to your near school where it should be in walking distance for pupils, surely this is the way to move forward. It's been backed up time and time again. Society polls of parents themselves. Let's, as Peter says, let's roll this out. Let's look at areas where there isn't school provision. Let's get schools in there, and let's look at isolated pairs as well.
I'm sure when we have the department in, the question around what they are planning to do around monitoring demand will be raised. I'll just bring Deputy Chair in there.
So, I suppose, the first point I want to raise is in terms of the statutory obligation on the Minister to encourage, facilitate and now support. So the original statutory obligation was strengthened. And I'm just wondering, has that had the desired effect? And are there any practical examples of where that statutory obligation has been utilised?
If I could just come in, I should have reminded everyone we have a tight agenda, so I'm asking everyone to try and keep to around 5 minutes for the question and answer to cover it.
You guys may have an example of that. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I'll say that.
I wasn't expecting a positive answer.
I do want to say two things though. I think we need to be slightly careful because we obviously, as people will know, have a judicial review that is, we're going to see if it gets leave in the next few weeks around the Integrated Education Act and the strategy of the department in implementing it. In our view, it's not adequate, and that's the core part of the JR, or potential JR if we get leave. And we are thinking about the response to the £150 million that was withdrawn from integrated schools and one shared education campus in Enniskillen near Brookborough. So you get 10 integrated schools that were due under Fresh Start funding and were most of them nearly shovel ready, and they're now not getting that funding. And one of them we visited with Robbie, I think, was in Fort Hill in Lisburn, and and I hope they don't mind me saying it, but the mould in many of the rooms, water running down the walls. One room that the students couldn't use anymore because of the damp and the smell and everything else that was within it.
And the reason I'm asking you this is because on a number of occasions now, the Minister and other officials from the department have sat where you're sitting now and told us that they have to treat all the sectors equally. And that's not true, because in both the Irish medium and integrated education, there is a statutory obligation, Irish medium to encourage and facilitate, with integrated also to support. So it's not about treating every sector equally, it's about bringing those two sectors that have been historically discriminated against up to a level playing field with all the other sectors as well. And that's the difficulty. The Minister can use a statutory obligation, but in my view, he's choosing not to. And I just wanted to make that point. I want to make another point about integrated education, and you've heard me banging on about this, Paul, I'm sure on a number of occasions now. I support integrated education. My big criticism of it would be that it's not integrated enough. And all the evidence I have seen shows that where children from different socioeconomic backgrounds are educated together, it helps all the children. It improves educational outcomes of the kids from affluent backgrounds and from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I know integrated education focuses primarily on the religion of children in the schools, and I think that's a mistake, and I think there should be more focus on the socioeconomic background. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the Integrated Education Fund, what would your view be of integrated schools looking for grammar status or thoughts of introducing grammar streams within their schools? Thanks.
Pat, if I can come back to the sort of first point you're making in terms of what's happened in terms of the ministry. I mean, there has been a couple of development proposals that have been approved mid-down, which is an exciting development. There's also Causeway. There's an amalgamation of free schools as well there. But I think when the Minister of Education comes in front of you again, surely you need to be pointing your questions at development proposals. I think it's something like 50% of all development proposals are for integrated schools to move forward, become integrated, or expansion of numbers. So the numbers are there, and then I think, and I would rightly say what you're saying.
Just let me stop you for a second. Just in terms of the 25 or 26 schools that you mentioned at the start, Peter, who voted for integrated status, how many of them have been granted integrated status? Do you know? Because it would be useful in terms of interrogating the minister on an issue like that if schools were actually
The
asking?
pack that was distributed to the committee before the meeting had a table which broke that down. So if you refer to your notes, it has it broken down in there.
Well, the council look-
I'll look at that later, no problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I know your agenda is very busy, but whenever a question is asked, there'll be a whole lot of us wanting to say a whole lot of different things. Look, I agree with the general thrust of what you're saying, Pat, around socio-economic stuff. What I find doing this sort of work for a number of years is people will sometimes avoid the more difficult conversations and take the easier conversations. And so I do think we need to keep the religious balance as a primary focus of what we do, but the other foci should be including social and economic status. I think that there's a lot of great work done across all of the sectors in terms of socio-economic status. I don't think I have been in a sector where you see a greater balance of socio-economic backgrounds than the integrated
Well,
sector.
you see, let me stop you there, Peter, because there's a fundamental fault line in the education system here, in that we have the longest tail of educational underachievement on these islands, some would argue, in Western Europe. We're lagging way behind the 26 counties, way behind. And in research that was published last year by the ESRI identified academic selection and the fact that the school system is so segregated in terms of socio-economic background, and that's one of the reasons why there's so high a rate of underachievement.
And we've had this conversation before, and I don't want to
Ask
hog
for
the
a
conversation.
quick answer on this, because
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
another element on grammar streams as well. We've got do one
Look,
minute.
I believe in that. I was brought up in Ballybean, and I've said before, not a single child in my class passed or 11 plus, including me. And I found alternative ways around that to get to university. But the system let us down. The system doesn't work for working class kids. For most kids from a working class background, some of us find our way and some of us don't. But I believe that there are other kids in my class in what was then Carraway Primary School, now Brooklands Primary School, that could have achieved a huge amount more. Yes, absolutely there was. And I think all of us have an obligation to try and find answers as to how to support that through education and other means as well. And the research shows that mixed ability classes in schools, for example, do a lot for the lower achieving and don't really affect the higher achieving pupils. So that's okay. Now, IEF is about integrated education, doesn't have a particular policy on that. What the schools do is try to, they do their best within the existing legislation, which is you guys that are in charge of the legislation, to meet parents' demand, but also meet the other objectives of the schools. And I think you find 3 integrated schools, I think it is, have a grammar stream within them, I think it is. All of the rest don't.
But what's the IEF view on it?
Well, it's not a core part of what the IEF does. So do we have a formal policy on it? No. I've given you my view on it. I think it's really clear what my view is. And I suspect that's a majority view within the integrated sector.
We'll need to move on this one. I think so. No, honestly, we really, the time is so short. And other members will have other questions for you guys. So I'm going to have to move on to the next one. So Cathy is next there.
Can I come back and just a point of clarification to Pat Sheehan? He was asking
Paul,
about...
we're really short on time here.
I'm just asking about the development proposals. We said there's 26 development proposals, 8 were successful. So my maths isn't as great as maybe other people around the table. I make that 32%. I make that a fail maybe since 2019. So
well, some are still in the system, so they haven't been assessed.
But in terms of where we are now...
I'm going to bring Cathy.
Let's also break another
Peter,
myth.
I'm going to have to move.
2/3 of those
Peter,
are thriving, sustainable schools, not schools.
We're not going to get around all the members here who do want to ask you guys questions. They want to hear from you. So, Cathy.
Thanks, Chair. I want to ask, the conversation so far has been around primary and post-primary. So I wanted to ask a question around the early years and the early years settings in terms of integration, what your policy is on it, or surely an integrated early years model would encourage a natural uptake in the integrated education. And I'm just conscious that a lot of the community and voluntary sector, when it comes to preschool and early years, they're more in line with cross-community as opposed to integrated education. So what sort of direction or what sense of direction do you see in that?
Yeah, so I mean, you're quite right. A lot of preschool provision will be very mixed, very cross community. We researched on a few years ago, which suggested it wasn't as mixed as people might have thought it was, but on the whole, it's much better than primary and post primary level. We definitely see nursery provision as a natural way of helping to grow integrated education, have children educated together right from the get go. It's only been in the last, I want to say, 4 or 5 years when it's been possible for a nursery school to transform. That was clarified by the department in, I want to say, 2018, 2019. So we've since then had 2 nursery schools that have formally went through the transformation process. But within the IEF, recently, as last year, we held a conference for all nursery schools looking at kind of shared and inclusive practice, and providing information on transformation as a potential route to build on what they're already doing really well. Yeah.
Just in my own constituency in South Down, there are these cross-community preschools that exist, but the natural then is to go to their local school after that, which is very normally a Catholic school, or there's one integrated primary school around in my area as well, but it seems to be the natural path to go to the cross-community preschool and yet still go to the Catholic or Protestant school in the area as well. So it was just see if there was any sort of strategy developed around that, or is that something the department needs to be looking at within all of this?
I think it has to be part of the overall strategy, that there are routes for families and children once they've been in that kind of mixed cross-community environment to be able to continue that through primary and post-primary.
Okay.
Okay, that's grand. Kate, you're next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I actually put in a question about DPs and integrated status, and there are 12 that are still waiting, 7 for transformation, 4 for nursery units, and 1 for increasing admission. But when I asked about timescales, there was no response to that, so there's definitely a problem. Can I ask Pat's question about kind of gauging department ambition was around integrated education was pretty revealing, I thought, but just to shed a bit more light on the department's lack of ambition, not yours, in terms of the strategy for integrated education, there was a draft one, there was one that was then published. Can you talk me through kind of what engagement you had with the department, based on the fact that you're a key stakeholder? I'm assuming you had some engagement with them, and any kind of changes of note that we should be aware of?
Well, you're right, and I think the document is going to the Assembly, or has gone to the Assembly already, and has been recorded with the Assembly. The draft side of it, I didn't see it, but I'm told had some welcoming notes in it around the Integrated Education Act, which maybe the final document didn't. I'm told there was nearly £200,000 put in for implementation, which is now not there. It's £50,000, but I would have to double check some of that information. And I believe there was, and this isn't an anti-departmental thing. I think there are people within the department who are really positive about some of this stuff and want to do more. And I understand budgets are tight all round, but when you do get a final document, whatever the draft said, that talks about £50,000 to implement the Act, on top of what's currently being done, obviously, because there's funding goes to integrated schools like any other, and we just want it's about fairness. I mean, integrated schools just want a fair crack of the whip around some of this. It's not about extra money or anything, but £50,000 additionally to implement the Act is, I think I worked it out at 0.006% of the total budget of the department. It's pretty small. You're not going to achieve an awful lot with that. And as I said, I think the draft had a reasonable amount more, but we would say nowhere near still as much as was needed.
Chair, I think that's extraordinary that there was an expectation of almost £200,000 and now there's just £50,000. Have you had any engagement with the department around what happens with the number of students, kind of as more and more students taking up integrated education places, if there's going to be an increase in that funding? Have there been any discussions around that?
It's probably useful to separate out the money to support the implementation of the Act and the money that follows children in an integrated school, which is no different to any other school, local management of schools, the per pupil number. So as kids come into integrated schools, that bit's fine. Well, it's not fine. Every school will tell you they need more money for their kids. Of course they do. The money we're talking about, I think, is specifically to do with the implementation of the Act.
Okay.
So, I mean, an example of that is I think the department has set aside £20,000 to support ballots. I think that's been the case for a number of years. We have had 5 or 6 ballots per year.
And it's £3,000.
Well, it'll vary between 2 to 10, but around about there, depending on the size of the school and so on. But I think IEF has been supplementing some of that in order to make sure the ballots happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think put into context as well, Kate, then is the fact that in the history of the Integrated Education Fund, we have invested £26 million into integrated education and the growth. And maybe the question I would ask of the Department of Education when they come forward is how much money they have invested or plan to invest. That's £26 million from private donations and from individuals and none of us from statutory bodies. That's charities. People go out fundraising rather than collection cans. Parents come together. That's the amount of money that a charity has put into integrated education. How much money has the Department of Education put into it when it's very clearly in legislation that they have to support integrated education? There's a disconnect there.
Well, I mean, you said it in your presentation, but the fact that 72 of the integrated schools have been purely driven by parents and not by politicians is pretty damning. And the hope is with the Integrated Education Act, we'll start to be matching the ambition of parents who put so much on the line to start these schools. So thank you. We have lots of points to raise with the Minister when we see him in a couple of weeks.
Danny, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering, because we're having a lot of conversation the last number of weeks around special educational needs and placements. And I'm just wondering what interaction that your sector has with the Education Authority around setting up special provisions within schools, setting up the SPIMs.
I mean, as the Integrated Education Fund, it wouldn't be an area that we would be particularly addressing with schools. That would be more directly between EA and the schools, or perhaps with the Council of Integrated Education and the schools. But it's not an area that we have a particular relationship with schools on. Special educational needs, of course, is extremely important, but it's just not an area that we particularly focus on in our work.
No, so no problem. Just to gauge, because we've been asking that there's to see where it's at, but that's fine. That's all it was.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. Like Pat, I had the privilege of working with you guys towards the integrated education bill, and it's on record that I didn't support it. So my first question is going to be in around the finance of it. So one of the pressures that I came under, and one of the questions that I kept asking is how much will it cost and how much will the strategy cost? And the truth is, nobody gave a figure before we voted on the bill. That's the reality of it. Now, I do accept your point, Peter, that £50,000 probably isn't enough. But if we're going to legislate and we're going to be moving about money about departments and stuff, would it not be useful for, if I'm going to be lobbied, and I think integrated schools are fantastic, I want to support Fort Hill to the hilt in regards to these things, but how much is enough for the strategy? I think I've heard £200,000 now being discussed. Kate put that up there. Maybe I missed it. What is the figure do you think that is needed to deliver on the strategy? Not necessarily build the schools, because that's area planning, but in terms of the strategy.
I think
50,000 isn't enough.
I think, Robbie, you need to set very much more robust targets, and that would then drive budget. I mean, that's where, if you're going to have a number of schools open, there are a number of proposals, development proposals put for us. I mentioned a number of integrated schools. That will indicate if there's going to be 20 or 30 ballots in the next year, so you can actually work out the cost of each individual ballot based on the schools. So I think what we need to be asking is, what are your targets, and then the budget will follow that there. But I think a figure we have to keep coming back to is the Fresh Start money. The amount of money that was allocated and promised to 10 integrated schools. It
wasn't for to be fair. It was allocated before the strategy. The strategy came in legislation.
But
Peter's point was the £50,000 that been allocated for the strategy isn't enough. So I'm not saying how much is needed to build the schools. I'm saying to deliver on the strategy piece, and then build the plan for the schools that may be required.
I'm going to sound as if I'm avoiding that question, Robbie. I don't think it's up to us to set a budget for the implementation of the strategy. That's the Department of Education.
You did inform the strategy? Job. You'd agree you did inform the strategy, I would imagine?
Well, we had an input in our views in terms of the strategy.
Yeah.
But it's not up to us to plan for the whole education system in
No,
Northern
I
Ireland.
agree with that
integrated.
point, but your point, Peter, to be fair, is 50,000 isn't enough. So I'm asking, what is it? What would it be?
Well, I think you have to come up with a figure, as we said, of how many ballots you're going to have over the next number of years. I would give you one line of the figure, so it's going to be 100 ballots
I
a
agree with
year.
you, by the way.
And then,
In essence, I do. But
so you need to come up with robust targets, and actually then the targets then follow the budget. Like if you're going to have a target of one school opening per year or two.
I know I'm not going to get a figure on it. I've only got a maximum of 5 minutes. This is an interesting question, and I hope it's helpful. You've heard of the REC border. There seems to be to be an integrated schools border here. I'm looking at the map, which is basically the heat map of where the schools are. They seem to be concentrated in the eastern seaboard of Northern Ireland. In fact, it's just about getting into double figures when you go west of the Ban. There's a line down here from Newton Abbey to Newcastle where there seems to be the concentration of integrated schools. So what's the barrier, do you think? And let's be honest, try and be honest, what is the barrier to seeing integrated schools in other areas of Northern Ireland and not concentrated in what looked like it's literally the bottom right-hand corner?
I'll try and keep this brief and then come in, Sean, after.
Okay.
I want to be clear in terms of IEF. We are not critical of the other sectors and want to work with the other sectors. I'm a product of one of those sectors, and as is Paul, and as of course, yeah. And the quality of education, the standard and the commitment of some of those teachers in those schools is fantastic. And that's where I say, look, let's give parents the choice. And if parents vote to maintain the current sector, the current system, absolutely fine, no worries with that. And we've had a growth over the last number of years, especially the last 3, 4, 5 years. Not so much of a growth since the agreement. So there's about 4% agreement, went up to about 7%, and it's now up to 8%. And there will be more ballots in the next number of months. Of those 72 schools, and the majority of them, I think I'm right in saying, set up through parental demand, one was from the Catholic maintained sector. Mm-hmm. That's one of the areas I would like to see some growth in. What's stopping that within
none on the border? Literally, there's none that I can see anywhere near.
There's a wider discussion around some of that, and it's a really complex picture. And I wouldn't want to, single out any particular issue. I think we will all have issues that we can come up with ourselves. I would want to see more growth within Catholic maintained side of things. And the response to Pat's question partly is, when you talk about a school going integrated, you're talking about the core part of what this peace process is about, because you're talking about a school that is largely one identity becoming something that is open to all identities, and it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes time and patience and a lot of really hard work.
I really appreciate your answer, because I think it's a difficult one, and it's something that needs to be peeled back.
I was going to say on that particular issue, on the sectors, there may be an issue about levelling up the ability of all sectors to be integrated and stay within sectors as well. Yeah. Maybe that's something that should be considered. Because I want to see children and young people in the same classroom from different backgrounds. What sector that is doesn't matter to me particularly, so long as they're in the same classroom together.
I don't Robbie, and then
final one, and all three of you, and I agree with you, have started off, and then the other answers come in with parental choice, parental ballots, parental demand, parent-led. Is that only in regard to the choice of school, or is that in regard to all aspects of a child's education? From your perspective?
Well, I mean, with integrated education fund, Robbie, so what we're talking about is their choice of school.
It's only about so in terms of an integrated school, and there will be other debates that we will have in regard to where parental choice comes into it. Is it just in terms of, would you trust parents to have in all aspects of a child's education, or is it just in terms of the type of school?
Listen, we all have, well, I'm sure most of us have children going to school, or will have children going to school. As a parent, I want to have as much input as I possibly can, and schools that do maximise that are a good thing for the schools. And I think you probably see that in governance terms within a lot of integrated schools as well. I mean, you can't have a ballot in schools every day of parents to see a decision being taken, but you should see a balanced board of governors where I think the real focus is on parental needs, or the children's needs according to the parents.
Against the best interest of the child.
I'll draw a line at that stage. I just wanted to pick up on something that Paul referenced, because it had occurred to me looking at the act in advance of this session. You in response to Robbie asking about how much would this cost, and Paul, you were referring to the need for targets. You can't
Yep.
really call something until you know what you're trying to achieve. In terms of the requirements in the Act around targets and measurable benchmarks, do you think the department's doing enough in terms of delivering targets that can actually be measured and held to account?
I think we could have more robust targets. We could have targets in terms of more schools, more parental ballots, you know, transformations, more development proposals being forward. Those are the kind of targets we can put in there. And going back to what Robbie says, once you've got those kind of targets in there, you can kind of cost the things off. You're going to have 10 ballots, you can work out how much that's going to cost and how much kind of staff times that is for IAF or NICE or whatever for schools to transform. So I think once you have those robust targets in there, you can have a more robust budget as well.
Bear in mind, Chair, I know people will have taken a different view on the Integrated Education Bill / Act, and I know people who opposed it probably in many ways supported it too, but couldn't find a way to support it in the chamber. But regardless of that, this Assembly passed an Act. It is now law, and it includes reference to targets. And that's part of the reason why we are seeking leave to have a judicial review, because the department essentially said, we don't like those targets, so we want to choose other ones. You guys passed it. This is legislation. So that's what I mean when I say give meaning to it. That's what should be happening now. And so we can't say much about it because we'll see whether we get leave, maybe we won't. But the targets that you guys passed are not in the document that we're seeing.
Be interesting to see how the department respond to that when they're in a few minutes. Cara, do you want to come?
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you all so much for being here. We've had a good level of engagement with yourself, Paul, and recently in Corrine, Cologne Primary School was one of the most recent ballots that was successful for integration, and then there's a lot of movements in the Portrush Millstrand site. So I really welcome your level of engagement and updating myself and my party on where we are with integrated education. You had made the important point there about children from different backgrounds, beliefs coming together, and the role that integrated education can play in reconciliation, and talking about our future. I'm just wondering then, just a point of interest around what role do you think the integrated education sector can play in conversations around our constitutional future? Because I'm just mindful the classroom is normally the first place for debate. A lot of young people have been very vocal about wanting to rejoin the EU, and we want to have that conversation perhaps in a meaningful way, and we will have that shared space with different backgrounds and beliefs in one classroom. So what role do you see integrated education having in this conversation? And also, is that something parents ask a lot about?
I think all education, actually, no matter what type of school, should be playing a key role in enabling our children and young people to have those type of debates. I think for integrated schools, there's a particular emphasis. You know, the point of an integrated school is to bring different traditions together, which can still remain different, but be educated together. So I absolutely think in terms of the constitutional future, that an integrated school should be a space where kids can have those conversations and take it in whatever direction that they want. You know, that it's about them setting that agenda. I don't think it's something specifically we would hear from parents a lot, but I think as part of a wider focus on diversity, it should absolutely be central.
And it's not something that is. The IEF and integrated schools wouldn't have an opinion around that political stuff. And if I'm honest, and forgive some folks here, people will say to me, it's all about alliance. See people coming into an integrated school, isn't it? No, it's not. It absolutely is not. Whenever you go in and you talk to the pupils and you engage with them, you see all political spectrums are represented. And that's the point, that they hold to their political views, their legitimate political views. They're taught to recognise other people's political views. They are taught religious studies, and they respect those different religious backgrounds of pupils there. And I get told stories about how pupils from a Protestant background go to communions and stuff and come back and say to their ministers, can we have something similar here, because I really like that. And the Protestant minister can't always answer that question. That's what it's all about. And I tell a story. I went to Lagan, I think it was, I shouldn't say this, but I think it was Lagan. There was two pupils, one who was a staunch DUP supporter and another who was a staunch Sinn Féin supporter, and they went at it. And I was sitting there thinking, I'm going to have to separate these two students. what do you do? And they had their argument, and they left talking to each other, and one of the other pupils came up to me and said, because he had seen my reaction, said, don't worry, they're the best of friends. They're away to have lunch together.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. And it doesn't mean that they change their political opinion, but they get a much more rounded acceptance or understanding of other political opinions, and that's good for this society.
There's Ulster University did a piece of research about 2 or 3 years ago, and they looked at people discussing politics and the conflict situation in Northern Ireland over the last number of years. And something like 40 to 45% of young people have never had that discussion in school. But they're certainly having it in integrated schools, because you're going to have, as Peter says, you're going to have that row in a school, and you're going to go back in the same classroom and have that argument again. So there's there is that facility to have that argument. As I say, from own personal experience, I see my daughters talking all different types of politics and all different people mixing together. It's not a him and her coming together in a room and having an argument, and getting the bus back going, oh look, we won that argument, you didn't win that argument. They're actually there. If you can take one thing home from you today about integrated education, it's pupils together, all different backgrounds, in the same classroom all year long for 14 years of their life. There's no other education experience offers that in Northern Ireland apart from integrated education, and that should be supported by the Northern Ireland Assembly, and I feel it's still lacking.
Do we have time for just one?
Very briefly.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so we're having these conversations in a meaningful way as well. Just around then, you had touched on the rural schools aspect of things. My constituency in East Derry, I'm the only rep, on the west of the Ban. I'm just curious then about what conversations you've had with the department then around future-proofing within these rural areas, and essentially just what conversations that you've had.
Yeah, so I suppose that
Need to be a short and sharp one.
Very short and sharp. The department are aware of future schools. I can't speak for the department, but they seem quite enthusiastic about it as a model. The area planning bodies all are enthusiastic. The Inside cover this, they endorse it as an approach. So I think community conversations and get people together to discuss provision is going to be important moving forward, and I think there is support there.
Very brief.
I'll have to draw it because I know David is looking to come in here. So we'll, the future schools bit we will, I think, pick up with the department.
Of an area planning,
Area
please.
planning. We've got a separate briefing in area planning today as well. So we've a full suite of officials here who can engage with all of these issues. So David, I'll just bring you in.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the presentation so far. I think I was listening to Peter there speaking, and actually the vision, I think rightly diagnosed earlier on that those of us, and I wasn't here in the last term, but represent my party, who didn't support the integrated education bill didn't do so on the basis of objection to integrated education. I know you've said that, but I think it's important to say that outright. It was more about how we feel that other sectors should be treated relative to integrated, and the belief that those sectors should be treated equally in that regard. But the vision that Peter's laid out for our education and how people should be taught is not only in line with what I believe, but also what I experienced in terms of going to voluntary grammar and Grosvenor Grammar School. We worked very closely with Our Lady in St Pat's at Knock and doing politics and different things there. We were taught to respect people's backgrounds, taught different religions, all of that within a school, and probably didn't have, actually, to be fair, in terms of religion, the diversity that some schools in Belfast now have, basically as a consequence of the communities in which they now sit. There is greater diversity there in many of our schools, and I guess it leads on to the question. But I think that that whilst integrated schools will hopefully have that diversity, there are many in other sectors that also have that diversity. I think it's important to recognise that. But I was intrigued whenever you said about going forward, if there was an opportunity for schools to become integrated but stay within their sector. I think I was right in hearing what you're saying there. How would that work? I'm thinking of like schools in the Catholic maintained sector, for instance, if they wanted to become integrated but wanted to stay within that sector. I think that surely speaks of the ethos. In the same way, becoming an integrated school speaks of the ethos. A Catholic maintained school will rightly have their own ethos that they want to set for the school. How does that align in the sense that if you call yourself an integrated school, maybe people from a community that might not ordinarily send their children to that school might be more open to it because it seems to be more shared. Would it not be a bit of a red flag to them, regardless what sector? If you use Catholic Maintained as an example, that it would still say that school is not for someone from my community. I recognise that many of those schools take people and people go to them from different communities, but there's no doubt that would play on a parent's mind in making that choice. So how would that work in terms of the plan you were laying out there?
We take the first bit first. I mean, in terms of the wider diversity of schools, yeah, there are absolutely schools that have diversity. Obviously, the word diversity is a bit problematic, because what are we talking about?
Yes.
We're talking about the two main traditions. The analysis that Tony Gallagher and others have done as well shows there's about 1,000 schools in Northern Ireland. When you take out the integrated schools, only about 80-something schools have at least 10% from the other community, whatever that might be.
Some of those communities now, particularly in Belfast, I'm thinking though, whilst I understand where you focus on, that diversity is also made up of people from different nationalities.
Oh, absolutely. So that's exactly my point. If we're talking about the two traditions, there is not as much mixing in our schools as a whole as there could be. If we're talking about wider diversity, and people identify in different ways, we know this from the census, how we're identifying is changing. In terms of wider diversity, yes, we see that across all different types of school types. But the schools that have a mix that aren't integrated are to be congratulated on that mix, because parents and pupils are making that positive decision. But it is still the exception rather than the norm in terms of the two main traditions.
Well, and look at some of the statistics on it, because I hear that a lot from schools. And again, I have a utmost respect for across the sector for the schools. A lot of great work is done across all sectors. We want to work with all sectors. I just want to repeat that, because it's just the way it is. But from different schools, I will hear we're already integrated, and then you go on to the public website and look at it. I had somebody said we're already integrated, and I looked up the school they were talking. I'm not going to name it, and it was a school of 950 pupils, and there are 13 Protestants. It's not integrated. But even if you look at the governance of the school, where, for example, the religious orientation of the governors that are nominated because of religious background isn't integrated. And when you look at some of the other issues around how the school is managed, it won't be integrated. And the same on the other side, in other sectors as well. So you hear that, but in reality, it's not really happening. Now, what we have at the minute is a lot of people registering as other within schools. So you might get, just for the sake of argument, 33%, let's say 60%. I chose a Catholic Maintained school, so I'm going to choose a control school in this, an example, and it could be the other side as well. Just I don't want to comments taken out of context. You could have 60% who are from a register as Protestant, 5% Catholic, and 35% other. Might those other be from new communities and other faith backgrounds? Yes, they might. But I suspect most of them are people who were brought up Protestant or Catholic who just don't identify that way or don't want to identify that way. Does that make them members of the minority faith in that background? No, it doesn't. I think that other probably proportionately is the same as the 65.
As you ask, I guess.
Yeah, it's the 60, 65, or whatever I'd said before. But they register now as other for different reasons. I don't want to be associated with, I don't practice, I don't go to church anymore, whatever. But some schools will take that other as not the majority, and therefore we're already integrated. We're only.
Would some of your schools face difficulty in providing that diversity that you seek in communities where there isn't that balance in terms of the community? If you're in a town or a village which is 90% Protestants or Catholic.
To the question and then quickly to the answer, and we'll.
I do understand the question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, parts of Belfast are what is normally said to me. How can you get an integrated school in this part of Belfast because of its majority this or the other? And of course it's a challenge, and that relates also into housing and segregated housing and peace barriers and how people are closed off from other communities too. But it doesn't mean to say that school can't adopt integrated ethos and try and attract people from all sides of the community, including how it's governed, as well as other aspects of what that school looks like in one way or the other, including the sports that it offers, including, as with some schools, offering Irish language or not, and so on. So there are a number of ways in which a school, even in those communities, can try to reflect and be open to people from different parts of the community. And some of the schools,
online there, because
some of the schools say we're open to everybody. That's not a proactive support for integration. Open to everybody.
I would suggest that's similar to the sports that you were talking about. So
we had a very long intro to your question, so that's cut our time a bit short. Look, I want to thank all of you for your attendance today, and apologies, very conscious that time was against us, and it makes it difficult to get through all the questions in as much detail as you would have liked, but we really appreciate your time before committee today, and can assure you that the issues that you've brought to us will be raised, both with the department on the action plan and on area planning, who are both in front of us today. So all of that is very much on the agenda now. So we appreciate your time.
Thanks for hearing us. And just the final plea, you passed, whether you agreed or not, you passed the legislation. It is time to give meaning to that legislation. Otherwise, what's the point in passing it?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers. We have the officials here.
Yes, we have the officials ready. Do you want to keep going?
Yeah, can I just check with members, is everybody happy to continue, or does anybody need a quick comfort break at this stage?
Happy to continue.
Happy to continue, and consensus? Okay. So if you want to bring the officials through, that will bring us on to item 8 on the agenda, and that is an update from the department on the Integrated Education Act and associated action plan. So I would refer you to the Integrated Education Act Section 10 report, which is at page 40 of your papers, and a briefing paper from the department at page 11 of your table papers. So just bring the officials through and then we can make a start.
Hi there.
Afternoon. And thank you both for joining us. So for this briefing, can welcome Suzanne Kingan, the Acting Deputy Secretary of Sustainability and Infrastructure at the Department, and James Hutchinson, Director of Collaboration and Climate Change at the Department. So you're very welcome today, and thank you for your time to come and present to committee. I'm happy at this stage we have had a briefing submitted already in writing, so it's really if you have anything in particular that you want to add to that, and we would say up to 10 minutes, and I would emphasise up to 10 minutes. Keen to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. Trying as far as possible to stick to 5 minutes per inquiry, because we have another briefing immediately following this, so to make sure that we do give time for questions, I would just ask everybody to bear that in mind. But at this stage, happy to hand over to yourselves for any initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair, and just give a few brief opening remarks. And thank you for the opportunity to brief the committee today on implementation of the Integrated Education Act. I thought it would be helpful if I set out the overall position of integrated education within our system before providing an overview of the Act and the Department's response to it. It's important to highlight at the outset that education in Northern Ireland is based on the key principle, established in law, that children are educated as far as possible in accordance with the wishes of their parents. It is therefore a school system which encompasses both diversity and choice. Every child, every school, and every sector are important and valued within our education system. And all of our schools have key roles, particularly through the delivery of the statutory curriculum in building a reconciled and shared society. Integrated education, which provides exciting opportunities for children and young people from different community backgrounds to learn together, clearly has an important role to play in that process and within the broader education system. The committee will note that the numbers of pupils accessing integrated education continues to grow. Over 27,000 pupils in Northern Ireland are now enrolled across 71 integrated schools, and that is a 27% increase in enrolments over the last decade. Which equals 6,000 additional places in 10 years. Integrated schools aim to achieve a religious balance through admissions criteria which designate admissions to be 40% Protestant, 40% Catholic and 20% other. At system level, there's an excellent religious balance across all of our integrated schools, with 34% of enrolments from pupils of a Protestant community background, 35% from pupils of a Catholic community background, and 31% of pupils in our integrated schools designated other. Turning now to provide an overview of the Integrated Education Act. Prior to the Act, the Department of course had an existing statutory duty to encourage and facilitate integrated education. The Act amended the duty to encourage, facilitate and support the development of integrated education, and it also extended the duty to the Education Authority. The Act specifically defines support as identifying, assessing, monitoring and aiming to meet demand for the provision of integrated education, crucially within the context of area planning and the overall sustainability of the school's estate. It also defines demand in terms of providing sufficient places to meet that demand. The Department takes the statutory duty to encourage, facilitate and support extremely seriously. Our vision for integrated education is to create a vibrant and supported network of sustainable integrated schools, providing high quality education to children and young people. And in line with those duties, the Department provides a range of bespoke sector-specific support and investment, and it also adapts its key policies and processes to support the further development of integrated education. Annual funding of £650,000 is provided to the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education, which clearly has a key role in developing and promoting integrated education. A sectoral support team has also been established within the Education Authority. The Department's Integration Works Guidance assists schools considering transformation, and this is accompanied by a support fund for transforming schools. Key policies and processes have also been adapted to ensure that they encourage and facilitate the development of integrated education. And just to give a few quick examples, home to school transport policy, integrated schools are a separate school category, and transport is provided even if the child lives nearer to a controlled or maintained school. At Northern Ireland level, about 25% of pupils in mainstream schools receive transport assistance compared to 34% of pupils in the integrated sector. Similarly, the committee will be aware that the temporary variation process provides additional places beyond the school's admissions numbers. Again, integrated schools are considered as a separate category, and almost all temporary variation requests from integrated schools are approved. Equally, in the statutory development proposal process, unmet demand for integrated education is recognised and additional accommodation provided on approval of the proposal. There's therefore a very strong framework which encourages, facilitates and supports the development of integrated education. More specifically, in response to the Integrated Education Act, the Department has taken a range of key steps. Advice on the Act was provided to all policy leads in October 2022, and a draft consultation and engagement framework has now been developed. The Department's strategy for integrated education and the associated action plan were published in April 2023, with the action plan committing the Department to 15 specific actions around implementation with an accompanying support fund. And we can pick up on these actions during the discussion session. But I would draw the committee's attention to a number of important areas. Work to develop an outcomes-based accountability framework to accompany the strategy is progressing well. A review of integration works, that's the guidance for schools that are transforming, has now commenced. A working group is in place with relevant stakeholders and a principals group to draw on experience of using the guidance. The Education Authority has updated its website to provide information on integrated education for both schools and parents. Turning to demand. Research funded by the Integrated Education Fund and prepared by ARC, a joint research group comprising both Queen's University and the University of Ulster, has highlighted that demand can essentially be considered in two parts: a measure of societal inclination and the specific behaviour of parents in making school admission choices. And this reflects the fact that while in survey data it shows very broad and wide-ranging support for integrated education, when faced with making specific choices for their children, parents do not always express that indication in their school preferences. In terms of admissions, Last year, 98% of pupils whose parents chose integrated education as a first choice at primary were admitted to an integrated primary school, and 77% to their first preference post-primary school. So what does that tell us? In broad terms, sufficient provision exists to meet demand at primary level, but there are clearly some areas where there appears to be unmet demand at post-primary level. Equally, it's important to emphasise it's a mixed picture. There are other areas where existing integrated provision at post-primary is not fully utilised and places are unfilled. In fact, admissions data for 23-24 shows that for those parents who made integrated education their first preference choice, just 13% designated it as second preference. This creates a challenge in meeting demand for the department, given that we have to be mindful of both parental preference and the overall sustainability of the education estate. The department's recent report on integrated education considers the issue of demand in more detail, and it concludes that in 6 localities across Northern Ireland, the level of oversubscription for integrated schools indicates a level of demand beyond supply. For the committee's information, those areas are Belfast, Lisburn and Castlereagh, Ards and North Down, Antrim and Newton Abbey, Mid and East Antrim, and Newry, Mourne and Down. The department in response will commission NICE to engage with oversubscribed integrated schools in these 6 localities, and also commission NICE to potentially look at a call for transformation in these identified localities. This will aim to meet demand and in line with the Act to provide sufficient integrated places. We've also committed to annually gathering data on parental preference for integrated education and the factors considered by parents in making those preferences. I'm sure the committee will be aware that a wide range of factors influence parental choice, particularly the quality of education provision. So in conclusion, I would stress to the committee that implementing the Integrated Education Act is a key priority for the department, that a strong framework exists around the statutory duties, and that significant progress has been made since commencement of the Act. We're of course happy to take any questions that the committee might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I think that message came through very clearly from our previous witnesses from the IAF that the Act is now an Act and it does need to be implemented. And I think the phrase that they used was it needs to be given life. And I think it is important to understand today when we are considering this, how the department really in detail plans to give life to what is now a live piece of legislation. I wanted to ask about demand to start with. I think you're right to say that it is not necessarily a robust and straightforward measure just to look at the application process. So when the admissions process for schools is a complicated one, and if I could give my own personal example, when I was applying for my youngest child's primary school place, there was nowhere in the town of Newton Ards that I could have applied for that would have been an integrated place. So if that was being used as a measure of my level of interest in integrated education, it wouldn't have been an accurate measure because there is no integrated primary school in the town of Newton Ards. And similarly, when it comes to post-primary level, I know of a lot of parents who say, well, if I couldn't access a primary school place, I'm not going to roll the dice for an integrated place which might have attendance at an integrated primary school as part of its criteria. And then I think as you look at other locations across Northern Ireland, there may be areas where there simply isn't a provision of any kind. So I do think looking at admissions, we need to be really, really careful about using that as a measure. So bearing that in mind, what I really want to get to is a clear articulation of how the department plans to measure demand. It's one of the clearest actions arising out of the Act, that is now a clear duty on the department around that monitoring of demand and aiming to meet it. What is the measure that's going to be used? What is the approach that's going to be taken? Because I think that disconnect between survey data around interest in education and then the admissions figures, it's a complex picture. But we do need to be doing this. We need to be taking it seriously in terms of the Act. And I would really like to know a clear, without really, I suppose there's a lot of stuff in the material you gave us that read to me about articulating. It's very complicated, it's not easy, but I would like to know what is the approach that's going to be taken.
Thank you for the question, Chair, and I'll bring James in a second around some of the detail. I suppose to say, yes, the department accepts the point. If there isn't an integrated option, how can you possibly choose it as the second choice, or indeed even as the first choice? So it's an important, and it's a real issue, and it's not one, the department is aware of it and accept the point. I think we've made significant progress. So for many, many years, we had lots of opinion polls, lots of survey data that indicated a general societal inclination for integrated education, and that didn't materialise in huge growth, although there has been very positive increase in numbers across integrated education. There's been a mismatch between the two. What we've tried to do in terms of articulating demand post the Act is look at something that is more practical and that can be helpful. And I think you're quite right to point out that parental preference is only one tool in the armoury for the department, but it is an important one, and I think it is important to say that it has highlighted 6 key areas there where there is significant oversubscription for integrated education, and I think a very first practical outworking is for that data to be available for the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education, and for them to work proactively with schools in that locality, and also not just the integrated schools but also potentially other schools in those areas that might wish to transform. So I think that's a really positive step. We've also committed to collecting more data on the reasons for parental preference through the admissions process, and James can say a bit more on that, but just to say that's a really important way to get to the heart of the choices that aren't made, because that's the data that we don't have. Why did you not have an integrated school on your preference list? So that survey information is an important and practical first step in that regard. James, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll just add 1 or 2 points. I think the issue of the societal level information that Ark talked about, generally speaking, we don't have good longitudinal data, which is data over time. So we're going to work with the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey over a number of years and pose a number of questions in that survey, so we'll get good long-term data from it. That's the first point. The second point is that we do have good data from the admissions process. Now, you'll be aware, if anyone who's gone through it, you don't really want to be asked a question about your preference when you're making a choice. So this year we're going to go out with EA's permission and ask parents, would you like to be contacted in future to discuss why you chose a certain school? And then we can build up very detailed issues from people who've been through the system, live users if you like, and said, my child, I chose this school because of whatever it is, location, ethos, child-minding arrangements, family preferences, all those things are factors. And what we found is that there is a gap between what people say they'll do at a societal level and what they actually do when they come to make a choice. Suzanne's talked about those things as well around very complex issues. I mean, for example, how far do you want to travel? Do you have child-minding accessible to that journey? All those things are factors. So we'll try and gather data on that. And your particular point, Chair, that data we gather from, say, your location, we'd be able to ask parents, if there had been an integrated school, would you have chosen it? Because we currently don't have access to that type of data at a granular level. So these systems build up information for us, give us that picture over time, and it improves the planning of the department. It's very difficult to plan in the absence of data, and we did recognise that gap, and that's probably why you've seen quite so much in the paper about planning. I'd say the next phase around demand as well is we know the 6 key areas where there is a perceived gap, but there's also areas where there's no provision at all. So we have to understand why there's no provision there. So another phase will be, for example, working to find out in whatever area it might be. In your case, you've mentioned Newton Ards. Is there an issue there? So is there more work needs to be done to gather more information that could bring forward future information? So it's in that sphere at the minute of learning and building and hopefully moving on and planning on the back of it.
That's helpful. I want to just ask one other thing, and there were many issues arose from the IAF briefing, so other members will raise them, and that was around targets and benchmarks. The Act was quite specific around targets in terms of implementing the Act that would include timetables, there was measurable benchmarks, but you referenced an outcomes-based accountability framework.
Yeah.
Given that was quite specifically detailed as a duty in the Act, I just wonder if you could clarify why we seem to have departed from that.
I can clarify that the Act set out a methodology that could be followed, which was a set of targets. When trying to design the strategy initially, you'll recall the Act came into law in 2022. We set the work up towards the end of that year, and we put the strategy out in place in April 2023. To be straightforward about it, the timeline we had meant it was a developmental strategy. We needed to actually work up to the information we've currently gathered on demand, for example, and build that up. So the strategy was essentially a series of actions to get things moving. So we wanted to do work on demand, develop a strategy for engagement, all those things.
Can I just come in, because I'm just to make sure from my understanding,
sure.
I mean, the phrase that I'm reading is it must include targets, must include measurable benchmarks against which the success of the strategy can be assessed. So it's just to understand how is the department going to deliver that?
Yeah, I think one thing we would say is the action plan itself does set 15 actions that we're taking to move the whole process forward. So that effectively is the process we're following. So I suppose in context, we've now completed the first report, and from that you've already seen the number of issues have come up there for further examination. So this process is now going to move forward into the next phase, which is revising the strategy and bringing forward further action. So this is an evolutionary process at the moment. I think you'd probably the best way to describe it.
I think it was highlighted in terms of resourcing the strategy, that if you don't really know what you're aiming for in terms of we would like to deliver X number of transformations or whatever the target might be, that it's difficult to resource it. But I'll leave it there. Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Suzanne. First of all, I just want to ask you if you believe that the statutory obligation to encourage, facilitate and support is not a passive obligation. I mean, you have to be active to actually implement that. And then following on from that, I suppose, I mean, the obligation was originally just to encourage and facilitate. It was strengthened by the Integrated Education Act. And can you tell the committee just how that statutory obligation has impacted on decision making within the department? And can you give some practical outcomes of the way it has impacted on decision making within the department?
Yeah, so just to say, we are absolutely clear that the duties are not passive. That's been clarified by various pieces of case law, both relating to integrated education and the Irish medium education. You know, we've had the Drumrad judgment, the Tracy judgment, etc. So we're very clear that the duties involve actively removing barriers and actively taking steps, and that's why I'd referred at the outset to that twin pact policy, where we provide a range of sector-specific investment, and we're very clear that it's not repercussive necessarily to other sectors when we provide investment in either the integrated or indeed the Irish medium sector. We also take proactive steps to adapt our policies to make sure that they flex for those sectors to support their growth. So we're very clear in that. In terms of the definition around support, the Act has a very specific definition in terms of support, which is around demand and measuring the demand, defining it and aiming to meet it. And I think that's the work that I've been talking about to date in terms of looking at getting a definition of demand, actively identifying those areas where there is demand in excess of supply, working then with NICE now to bring forward active plans in those areas. So I think there's a very clear change there in terms of the department's approach, the work that James is talking about as well in terms of the survey data. All of that sits right behind the duty around support. James could maybe say a little bit more as well about just our changes in terms of even consultation, James, with key bodies.
I think one of the points the Act does specify in Section 3 is that those are bodies identified under the Act, and we now would consult with NICE, with CSSC and with IEF in everything we do around that's relevant to this. So we've actually increased our engagement with those groups because they represent the sector. And we also,
I suppose, James, not to cut across you, but what I'm really looking for is a practical example of where this statutory obligation impacted on decision making. Let me give you one area where decision was made, or policy development. So we had the reprofiling of the Fresh Start funding, which was supposed to be for new build integrated schools. And, you know, it could well be argued that reprofiling contravened the statutory obligation. So when that decision was made, the minister had to say to himself, I have a statutory obligation to encourage, facilitate and support integrated education. So how does that dovetail with my decision to reprofile that funding?
For the committee, the Minister for Education didn't reprofile Fresh Start funding. The Treasury, as part of the discussions about the restoration of the executive, unearmarked 150 million of Fresh Start funding that had previously been ring-fenced and placed it into the package that was for the restoration of the executive. It was no longer earmarked. The department was not consulted on that, and the Education Minister did not make a decision around it, so I have to be really clear on that. There was no
decision. The Minister could have made a decision to leave it with the new build integrated schools.
So again, just to clarify, Pat, the Minister, that money had been unearmarked. It had gone to the executive. It had been taken away from the Department of Education. The Minister had no choice in that decision, and that decision was made. In fact, the Minister wrote to the Secretary of State to ask the Secretary of State to restore the funding for both. And I just want to clarify as well, Fresh Start funding was not just for integrated schools, it was for integrated and shared education, and it always was for both. Not only did the Minister do that, the Minister also, because of the statutory duties to encourage, facilitate and support, and they were explicit in his decision making, did not stop or cancel those schemes when the funding was taken away by the UK government, but instead placed them into his own major works programme to be progressed in planning. So there was no decision.
And I understand all of that. But the Minister had funding there about which he had to make decisions.
No. The funding had gone. The Minister, when he took office, the Fresh Start funding had already been removed, just to be absolutely clear on that.
He didn't bid. He didn't bid for that money.
He did. He bid for the executive, not to the executive, sorry, to the Department of Finance for funding for every single integrated scheme. In fact, Millennium Integrated was either the first or second top priority in his bids, so he did bid for the money from the Department of Finance. He absolutely did.
The 150 million. But we'll move on.
Right.
Deputy Chair, did you have any further questions?
No, that's me. Thanks for that, Susan.
Well, thanks.
Kate, you were next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Is it true that the draft strategy for integrated education included almost £200,000 as opposed to the £50,000 for implementation, and that there was a ministerial forward and paragraphs that were supportive of integrated education and they were removed before being published?
There was an early draft. That draft, because of timing issues, we had to cut it back a bit to get it through the process. We were trying to get it as up to date as possible, with as much information as possible. And that early draft that was shared with colleagues was then I suppose, summarised and shortened for publication.
I think it's probably not that appropriate for us to comment about the policy making processes in terms of policy under development. The strategy is the strategy that's published and the report that's laid before the Assembly is the report that's laid before the Assembly.
Okay. I'm just trying to ascertain kind of ambition around it. In that case, can I ask about the working group? How is the membership of the working group decided, and is there a potential issue if members within it maybe are not necessarily supportive of integrated education?
I think we took a decision very early on in the process to engage with all parties in the education sector. We didn't want anyone excluded from the table, and that will include people who may be less disposed than others towards certain types of education systems. So everyone's at the table. They have an equal voice, and their views are valuable to us in forming policy. So I think it would be remiss of us not to take input from the whole sector as we're developing process and policy.
Okay, and have any of those meetings happened in person, or are they only online?
Because of the range of participants across the number of organisations, it has actually worked much better to have them virtually, purely because of logistical reasons of getting everyone together.
Okay, you think that helps kind of have discussion?
We have had a number of sessions, certainly around the OBA development, where we've had groups together in a space, and they have been very useful. So we would be certainly aiming to have more of those meetings in future in person, if situation allows. Given the number of people attending and the pressure on diaries, it's been difficult to organise to date, but we would like to do that.
And we are very conscious about public finances at present. A lot of meetings have been moved online to make sure, to avoid the situation where multiple officials are travelling and claiming travel and expenses. So we're very mindful of that, given the current pressures on the wider budget position across the public sector. So there is generally we do look at virtual first. Now, of course, if there's situations where face-to-face engagement would be helpful, particularly if you're working, for example, with children and young people, it's often easier to talk to them face-to-face. Of course, we will do that, but we do have to be mindful in the current environment of cost as well.
Okay. Thank you. And then the only other thing that I was going to touch on, which I think has been raised anyway, is just the issue with kind of lack of targets and benchmarks within the action plan. It seems to be moving away from the Act. That was something that was raised quite a bit by IEF and
I would direct you towards the draft OBA piece in the report, which does look at the phrasing we're using here is benchmarks, and the process towards the outcomes process benchmarks towards that outcome. So we're looking at what we can do in terms of measurable targets and outcomes in that process. So it is part of the similar process. It just doesn't use the same words that maybe IEF would refer to. But to deliver an outcome, you must have measurable benchmarks along the way, which are akin to targets.
Okay.
Yeah, I think also the department has to be very mindful, for example, that it is the keeper of the development proposal process and would be ultimately the decision maker, for example, in regard to new integrated provision, new transformations, etc. So NICE is there, the Education Authority is there, and I think it is important that the department doesn't put itself in a position where it's setting targets that it then makes decisions in order for itself to meet those targets. I think we have to be careful around being judicious around our roles and our responsibilities to the education sector as a whole as well.
Okay, thank you. And then just the final point on DPs. There are still some quite outstanding. Is there any hope of the ones that are outstanding moving forward soon? I'm thinking of Cantil in my own constituency.
If I don't have the detail of the development proposals here, but if it's agreeable, I can write to you with some details about where they are in the process and come back to you on that in writing if that works. Okay.
That'd be really helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
It does seem to sort of be general feedback, and it probably doesn't just apply to integrated schools, but the development proposals take a very long time for decisions to be made on them. There are more sitting waiting that affect integrated schools, so again, anything that can be done, I think, to speed up that process of decision making on DPs, I think would be welcome.
I think it is that balance, Chair, between making sure that there's a robust and evidence-based process, and that all the issues and concerns that are raised about any particular proposal are fully examined and the full suite of evidence necessary to form decision making. It is obviously balancing that with ensuring that the process is efficient and works in the way that it needs to for stakeholders, and that always is a balance.
Of course, decision making should be robust, but it can always be improved in terms of the speed it operates at as well. Robbie, if you want to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, and sorry for having to leave there briefly. The IF were very strong on the fact that, and I'm sorry if this has been asked and missed the Chair, but that £50,000 was just not going to be enough. Now, I did press them in terms of what they thought that the figure should be, and it didn't necessarily give it to me, but I probably agree with them to some extent. My first question would be in terms of how was the £50,000 arrived at? Was it a fixed number that was given, say, build a strategy to that? Or is there any cost set aside to the strategy that the department can stand over and say, this is where we believe we'll deliver on it?
I think, Robbie, there's, and say I'll bring James in the second, but there's a couple of points. The first is, it's important not to see that figure in isolation, because a lot of the spend that the department takes around integrated education isn't in a direct earmarked pot to support the action plan and the strategy. So, for example, I'm going to actually use integrated construction projects. At the minute, we have 8 on site. We've spent there of 194 million. So there's a wide variety of spend. If a development proposal is approved, for example, we've had the mid-down, the new post-primary and mid-down, and we're working with them to provide accommodation solutions. So the reality is that as we meet demand and development proposals come through and they are approved, The significant spend is around implementing those proposals, whether that be in terms of accommodation, whether it be in terms of temporary variation policy, in putting more places into an integrated school. So the costs are quite often practical and specific at a point in time, rather than being, we need funding to do this, this and this. So the 50,000 is really a base level of funding if there's some specific actions that we need to take in that more narrow sphere around supporting the specific implementation of the Act. But I think you have to set that in context. A lot of the outworkings of the Act and the growth of integrated education are funded at the point of need, rather than out of a specific pot that's sitting there that wouldn't be sufficient. I hope I'm explaining that.
Okay. And I hope this question sounds constructive, if you like, in terms of the strategy and the creation of the strategy, which obviously was an outcome of the legislation. Who was involved in constructing? Was that an internal departmental construct, or were there SMEs that were involved in the construction of the strategy? And who was sought, apart from the external consultation? But what was the team that was it an internal department team? Was there other people that fed into that? Be that politicians, political parties, or subject matter experts? And and in that, was there then was there a feedback loop then that either shows satisfaction or dissatisfaction with regard to the team that was put together?
Yeah, a couple of points there. The strategy was developed. First of all, the strategy has to be made by the department, but we made that strategy in consultation with interested parties. So essentially, the group I described earlier of all the sectoral representatives, including IEF, who were at the table along with NICE, CCMS. CSSC and others, and that was a development group, so it was very much an iterative process, and that working group as well examined issues the strategy needed to look at. So for example, the strategy in terms of its vision, that vision was agreed by the group, and the department then accepted that vision as being the way forward. So very much an iterative process, participative development if you like, and then at the end there was a consultation on the action plan, which we also held some online events, conscious of the times we were in. And we had a number of, I think, 176 submissions and feedback and so on. So we laid a report in the Assembly on that particular feedback process, and it broadly positive. So yes,
there's a good mixture, I think, of direct engagement with key relevant stakeholders. Obviously, in line with good policy making, we've done the wider public consultation piece, again with some direct engagement events, and there was direct feedback as well on the draft of the strategy.
We did. I mean, for example, we went along to the Aptus conference, spoke there, took direct feedback from practitioners. We took various one-to-one meetings as well with participants, not just in the group session. So there was a good level of mixed interaction and sort of good policy formation, I would describe it as.
And in all our policy making in the department, we are very conscious of the need for engagement, the need to involve practitioners, interested parties. They need to follow all the guidance around public consultation, and the strategy for integrated education is no different. Obviously, with all the department's policies and processes, you won't get 100% support and satisfaction with all policies, but we work to make sure that we take account of feedback from stakeholders, that wherever possible and practical, that we build that into our approach. And we're working all the time to improve our policy making and to really get the process.
And is there a register of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the no, not really?
We wouldn't measure it in that way.
Just the responses in the consultations, possibly.
Responses in the consultation, the conversations that we have with people, the written feedback that some of the interested parties would provide in terms of the strategy. I don't think we would quite measure it as satisfied and not satisfied. I don't think we do, because responses are a self-selecting group, and by their very nature, those who are dissatisfied are much more likely to respond.
And those that were involved.
Briefly, Robbie, on this one, yeah, just hit.
Those that were involved in the construct will be available. I take it they're listed somewhere. So it's
the list of consultees absolutely is there.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Are there any other members looking to come in on this item at all? Just checking not any other indications. No. Okay, you got through that quickly. I'll ask another question then before you go.
Don't put your books away.
I expected that to run a lot longer. There was a question I had wanted to ask, but it didn't really come out from the IAF presentation. But again, in the Act, one of the things that the strategy is meant to draw out is around to measures to sort of ensure the integrated ethos of schools, that is something that is maintained and promoted. I just wanted to get a sense of how that is factored into the action plan. I'm always struck when I visit integrated schools that they are very, very proud of their ethos, and it is something that they want to have front and centre. And I just wanted to say again how the department, how you see your role in terms of that sort of preservation and promotion of that ethos within integrated schools.
I think one of the unique things about integrated schools is the ethos and the approach they take. And one of the things you'll note from our report is that NICE are very proactive in engaging with schools on ethos, and indeed they've worked across the year with schools to make sure that they have an understanding of their ethos and they can promote it and they can share that ethos as well around other schools. So I think that's our key vehicle for that. And I think one of the things that we see is when schools are coming forward with proposals, they really want to understand what the ethos is. And a lot of good resources now available through EA's website on, for example, FAQs, and where they can get information and help and support through either NICE or IEF or CSSC. So that's a key element of the whole development of the integrated sector, is the ethos and what that ethos really expounds in the school environment.
I think it's really important that is really maintained as a focus, as we see lots of transformations coming forward, that schools are properly supported to ensure that ethos is embedded.
I think sorry.
No, that's it. The review of the integration works guidance is part of that process as well, of giving schools updated guidance. The last version was 2017. We're updating it now, taking account of the Act and where things have moved since. So that is part of the suite of information schools can have to help with ethos and other points of practical transformation.
I think we also have to be mindful, though, Chair, that we don't place an unnecessary burden on integrated schools. We have to be mindful of that as well, that we don't impose significant levels of reporting or anything like that for integrated schools that aren't present in other schools. The Act is clear, it makes a definition of an integrated school, and that it's a controlled integrated or a grant maintained integrated. And I suppose I'm very mindful, our schools are facing huge challenges in terms of their budget, in terms of special educational needs provision, and our integrated schools, are out there doing a great job, like all of our schools across the system. And we don't want to put them in a place where, to gather data for the department, we put a lot of unnecessary reporting in place. So we have to be mindful of that and balance it. We have to celebrate what is unique about integrated education. And as James says, I think NICE are very good at doing that. Also, even in the current iteration of the Integration Works Guidance, it's very clear about the development of the ethos as part of the process. It makes it very clear, for example, around developing the vision for integrated education in the school, socialising what integrated education is about, having the action plan around the changes you're going to make. So all of those steps are front-loaded into the process before you transform, because it is very important that transformation is a real process, and that it's not just simply about a change in name or designation of school type, that it is about meaningful changes right across the school community. The only other point I'd want to add about that is, in terms of the statutory curriculum, there's really important elements of the statutory curriculum around PDMU in primary, personal development and mutual understanding, and local and global citizenship at post-primary, where all schools are encouraged to develop our children as citizens and as contributors to society, and look at those issues of respect, of toleration, of diversity in our society. So I think I just want to point that out as well, that there's really good work around ethos and around citizenship and identity right across all our schools in every sector.
Without a doubt, this role has given me the opportunity to visit many schools, and I don't argue with that at all. I think it's just particularly integrated schools they like to put their ethos front and centre, and it's just really to get that sense of what the department can do to support that.
100%. It's just getting that balance, isn't it, between not putting an undue burden but capturing what's there and what's good.
Thank you. So if there's no other members looking to come in, that's great. Thank you for your time. I think we'll maybe take a short comfort break through and if members can be back for 4, and then we'll make a start with.
Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. I think we'll maybe be seeing you in the next session, Suzanne, potentially. Yes. You're not getting off that lightly.
Good luck for Wednesday.
We could just move in and close.
Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
Yes, please, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah,
We wanted this is my sort of backup book.
You're all.
Left the book sitting in the house.
I mean, at least I'll say.
This is a high chair.
Okay, members, so that is us back into open session. So we are moving on to item 9 on the agenda, and that is a briefing from the department around area planning. So I would refer members to page 85 of their packs, which is the Schools for the Future, a Policy for Sustainable Schools document, and then a briefing from the department at page 13 of your table papers. So, Suzanne, you're welcome back. Everybody else, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Chair. And
do you want to do introductions? As there's a number of you. Yeah.
Yes. So I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Okay.
I'm Scott Harbinson. I'm head of school admissions team in the department.
Lorraine Finlay, head of area planning development team.
Emer Broderick, Acting Director of Sustainable Schools Policy and Planning.
Bill Stevenson, I head one of the area planning policy teams.
Thank you. So you're all very welcome here today. Conscious it's a big panel of witnesses, and we are tight enough for time. So if I could ask everyone just to bear that in mind in terms of keeping answers, succinct and to the point for the questions, and members the same when it comes to asking questions. I'm going to ask just for you guys to open up with an opening statement, up to 10 minutes. I would emphasise up to 10 minutes. We've had some fairly detailed briefing papers sent through, so it's really anything that you want to add to help set the scene for members, and then we will take it from there. So
thank you, Chair, and to save you having to listen to me again, my colleague Eamon is going to do the opening remarks on behalf of the department.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. So thank you, Chair, and to you and members of the committee for the opportunity here today to brief you on two areas that fall underneath my area of responsibility, namely area planning and school admissions processes. Okay, so for the purpose of today's briefing, we propose to provide you with a general overview of the area planning and admission processes, and to provide an overview of some of our recent work and to make processes more agile and efficient. And you'll find further details in the briefing paper that's already been provided. So if we turn to and begin with area planning, the Sustainable Schools Policy dates from January 2009, and it sets the vision for every learner to achieve his or her full potential at each stage of their development. And at its core, its aim is of ensuring that all pupils have access to a high quality, broad and balanced curriculum that meets their educational needs in schools that are educationally and financially viable, and which takes account of the expressed preference of parents for a diverse system of education that we have. Members will note that the focus is on children, not sectors or institutions. A high quality education for children means access to the broadest range of curricular and extracurricular activities, and it's vital that parents can have the confidence that the school that they choose for their child has a secure future and be able to meet the needs of that child for the duration of their time in that particular phase of education. So notwithstanding the publication being in 2009, the vision sets out the Sustainable School Policy remains appropriate and has been delivered since 2011 through the area planning processes. Area planning is a process of strategic planning of education provision, and that planning takes place in a complex, challenging and indeed a litigious environment. It has been developed to support the implementation of the Sustainable Schools Policy. The first regional area plan for education in Northern Ireland, providing pathways strategic plan for schools 2017 to 2020, was first published in 2017, and we are now in the delivery of its 5-year successor, the Strategic Area Plan for Sustainable Provision. It's characterised by 3 operational plans, the first which sets out the area plan priorities for 2022 to 2024. Operational Plan 2 is in development, and it will set out the priority work streams for delivery in the 2 years from September 2024 to the 31st of August 2026. The current 5-year planning cycle has been characterised by publications of Northern Ireland's first Strategic Area Plan for Special Education Provision, known as CSAP. And each of the operational plans include work streams for both mainstream and special education provision. I know the committee has received recent briefing on special educational needs provision and the challenges that are being met around placements pressures for September 2024. It's important for me at this juncture to differentiate between that work and the work streams in respect of special educational needs provision that are expected under Operational Plan 2. There is a distinction between emergency planning and strategic planning, dealing with the immediate pressures, and in particular those of ensuring that every child with special educational needs has an appropriate placement for September 2024, falls outside the remit of this directorate. That work is now being delivered by the SEN Placement Strategic Working Group, which is currently chaired by the Department in association with colleagues in the Education Authority. The focus for special area planning and Operation Plan 2 will be characterised by actions to address projected, continued growth and the need for capacity over the medium to longer term. The end-to-end review of SEN, the development of an inclusion policy, the recent announcement of a bespoke SEN capital programme, and the existence of a dedicated strategic plan for special provision will collectively create that platform for the delivery of a better future for our children with specialist needs. Turning to provision in primary and post-primary schools, I would like to provide members with some high-level figures of changes delivered through area planning to the educational landscape between 2010-11 to 2022-23. An additional 22,000 children and young people are now being educated in sustainable schools, and 31,500 available places which were not required have been removed from the system. This has provided a better baseline for planning future requirements. It has also facilitated a focus on high priority work streams that will tackle unsustainability while simultaneously ensuring the right number of places of the right type and at the right time. There has been some criticism of the pace of area planning and in particular of development proposal processes, and such criticism should be viewed in the context of this being a statutory process and the level of legal challenge to decisions which are always taken in the interests of children and young people and not of sectors or individual institutions. Legal challenges, even though they come at an added cost and are resource intensive to defend, they are helpful. We learn from them, and we factor that learning into our ongoing review of processes. That feedback loop is factored into ongoing review and refresh of activity around guidance and procedures as a further means of ensuring that the sustainable schools policy has currency and relevance in the planning sphere. Our processes and decisions to date that have been taken through them have repeatedly been challenged and found to be robust through the scrutiny of the courts. As members will be aware, the Department has also statutory duties to both the Irish medium and integrated sectors. Both sectors operated within the overall area planning sphere have seen just over 70% of all published proposals being approved, supporting sustainable growth of both sectors. We have also identified opportunities to make improvements and efficiencies, and scoped out and delivered a number of pilot projects to make changes to provision outside the development proposal process. These projects have again focused on supporting sustainability in our schools, and their collective impact gives an effective assessment of supply and demand for school places in all areas. In 2020-2021, we took over 9,000 unneeded available places from the system in advance of a publication of the current strategic area plan through an exercise called resetting. This was a decluttering measure that facilitated better focus on work streams to tackle unsustainability in our system rather than less important work streams. Through a normalisation process, primary and post-primary schools which have consistently exceeded their approved admission and enrolment numbers have had their approved numbers normalised without the need of a development proposal, and this allows 21 successful sustainable schools to react to parental preferences and to enrol higher numbers of children with an overall uplift of just under 1,300 places. From the school admissions perspective, an additional places exercise has aided the school's admission process for the post-primary transfer for Year 8s, where there's not always a sufficient number of places in some areas. An exercise for 2023 to 25 has provided 267 additional Year 8 places allocated to a number of schools to ensure the admission processes could be concluded on time and the number of children still to be placed at the conclusion of the admissions process. This exercise builds on similar exercises dating back to 2019, by which a total of almost 1,500 temporary places have been added outside of the development proposal process to alleviate pressures in specific localities. And given the urgent need to address the increasing demand for special educational needs, the Department has worked with the Education Authority to develop the specialist provision in mainstream schools process, which facilitates the establishment, closure, or change of special provision at sustainable mainstream schools in an agile and efficient and expedient manner without the need of a requirement of a development proposal. Turning now to school admissions. I have also responsibility in the Department for school admissions, and I would like to clarify that this relates to the admission of children through the competitive admissions process to primary and post-primary schools. Children with a statement of educational needs are placed through a different process, and admission to preschool education is overseen by the Early Years Directorate in the department. And it might be useful for me to explain the responsibilities of each organisation in the school admissions process. Overall, school admissions policy, including timetables for the annual school admissions processes and guidance, which includes recommendations on admissions criteria schools should and should not use, rests with the department. The Education Authority operates the school application processes, which permit the nomination of preferred school by parents and facilitates the admission appeals process for parents who believe that their children were incorrectly denied a place at a preferred school. Individual boards of governors set and apply admissions criteria to select children for admission, and importantly, the department plays no role in selecting which children will be admitted to any given school apart from the issue of guidance as previously mentioned. The department, however, may increase schools' approved numbers to cater for demand as it arises, and the additional places exercise, which I have mentioned previously, has enabled the department to allocate area places in areas and school sectors where oversubscription was anticipated in advance of the admission processes commencing. The department can also allocate further additional places by way of the temporary variation process, a process which allows the department to respond promptly and appropriately to demand as it arises, and to ensure that we can secure places for children in their preferred sector within a reasonable distance of their home should pressure on places arise. The committee may be aware that this year's primary admission processes has recently concluded with almost 21,000 applications. All but 16 children secured a school placement during that process. This equates to 99.9% of children, and furthermore, 98.6% of applicants secured a place at their first preference school. Parents of those 16 children have started to nominate alternative schools and will subsequently be placed. Over 7,000 places remain available across Northern Ireland. And this year's post-primary admission processes is due to conclude on the 18th of May with the issue of placement notification to parents. I hope the committee has found this high-level summary useful, and we're happy to take questions on any of these areas mentioned or broader issues of interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamon. I'll make a start. I think you'd made reference there in your opening remarks that the department's confident that the current approach to area planning does deliver the right outcomes for the school system across the board. I just wanted to highlight the Independent Review of Education's analysis of the system, and it was quite clear that it took a different view. I think I'll quote: "The current area planning processes and structures inhibit innovative cross-sectoral solutions and hinder the pace at which transformation can occur. The current development proposal process and a sectoral-based area planning process are not appropriate for implementing change, and recommend a new set of indicators for sustainability." So I would be keen just to hear from the department's perspective, and I know that the Minister has said there is a process in terms of responding to the independent review's recommendations, but just as an initial starter, what would your assessment be of the independent review's assessment of the area planning process and the sustainable schools policy and how it fits into that?
Eamon will come in with some of the detail now, Chair, but I suppose just to emphasise that the department is collating work on its response to the independent review at the global level, and the department's work has to be put to the Minister, and the Minister has to consider that and will brief the committee in due course once that's work carried out. So I don't think it would be appropriate for us to go into detail about the departmental response to the committee's recommendations. That will be a matter that it is being looked at. It will be put to the Minister, and there will be a published outcome in due course. I don't think it would be appropriate for us to discuss it with the committee in advance of having discussed it with the Minister.
In terms of the assessment that it is really a sectoral process, that it is a lot of it is around sort of the interests of sectors, and I know the Sustainable Schools policy does reflect that. It does say that the interests of sectors are very important in how the Sustainable Schools policy is rolled out. Is there any appetite within the department for looking at whether or not this process does actually deliver the right outcomes effectively for children and the communities that they live in Northern Ireland? Because I would say, as an outsider looking into the system, it feels quite a mysterious process to me, that it's sectors get together, they seem to hammer something out in a darkened room, and a plan comes out at the end. That would, I mean, and I'm not being flippant in that. That is, it genuinely doesn't feel like a process that I think is transparent or well understood by the public. Do you think there is work to be done?
And other
in that
colleagues will
space?
give you a little bit more information, Chair, on the actual process and how it works in practice, and also, of course, there are areas in any process that can be improved and built upon.
Yeah, I would probably say, Chair, that it's both a complex and complicated piece of work of an area planning. The backdrop is we've got, if you look at preschool places, it's currently, if you look at the numbers, it's going to go down from where it's at the moment, 23,000 places, forecasted projected to go down to roughly 19,000 places. Primary phase is something similar. It's going to go down from 172,000 places down to 136,000 places. Post-primary is actually going to go up slightly from about 139 places to 144,000 places. And in special schools, well, that's got the most dramatic rise. It's going to move up from 7,500 places to 16,000 places. Okay? So within that, we've got very mature, comprehensive sectors, both on the maintain side and on the control side. We've got burgeoning new sectors of integrated and Irish medium that are growing and want to grow. Within that, we've got a falling demographic at primary level and a preschool level, but with an increasing multiplicity of needs of children that have specialist needs. So trying to plan for all of that is somewhat complex and complicated.
I appreciate it's complex. I suppose the question initially really is just, do you think that it's clear and transparent to the public how the process actually operates?
Well, whenever we go to instigate the outworkings of area plan, it's a statutory process guided underneath Article 14 of the 1986 Education Library Northern Ireland Order. It's a statutory process, and it's got two specific statutory tests. If there's going to be a significant change, and if that such a change is going to have a significant impact on the wider area, well then a development proposal has to be brought forward and published. Within that, Chair, there's complete transparency to the public, both at school level and local community level, and indeed the wider area, because there's a major consultation piece that has to happen. So therefore, and in that consultation piece, everybody within that area, both at school level, community level, and the wider area, get an opportunity to see what that change is, what is the likely impact, and they have then an opportunity to put across their views in that process. So it may be mystifying to some, but actually because it's a statutory process, there's complete transparency in what those changes that are being brought about through the area planning spheres that exist.
And I suppose just to emphasise, Chair, all the sectors are represented as part of the area planning process. The area planning guidance, development proposal guidance, all of that is published, it's consulted upon, there's wide-ranging engagement, so there is a clear process. Of course, like any process or policy, can we always be working to improve public understanding and engagement with our stakeholders? Of course we can, and of course we accept that, and area planning and development proposals are absolutely no exception to that. But there is a clear process, it's set out, there's clear and careful guidance around it, and we have been successful as well within that framework in bringing forward a number of innovative cross-sectoral solutions. I would draw your attention, for example, to the shared education campuses at both Ballycastle and at Limavady. And have the number of shared campuses, for example, been at the volume and scale we may have hoped? Perhaps not, but there are innovative solutions there. Work on the Stroll shared education campus is nearing the point where contract award can be made. Has integrated education and Irish medium education successfully grown within the context of area planning? Absolutely. And as Eamon referred to in his opening remarks, have we successfully removed, for example, available places from the school's estate? So there is a lot of success there. There is a clear process. It's set out. Can it be improved on? Of course it can. Every process and policy can be improved upon.
I'm sorry, Chair, we just had that. We do have grounding documents and strategic area plans that set out by each local government district a snapshot of data, and then an analysis done by the EA as to where I think it needs to be, what work streams need to be developed to make the provision in that area more sustainable than maybe what it already is?
I'm happy to leave that question where it is. I certainly am looking forward to the department's response around the need maybe for an independent oversight of the process. I want to ask, I mean, briefly, just it was touched around on special educational needs, and I'm sure other members will be concerned about this issue, and we've discussed it at length in this committee. Has there been a failure to plan appropriately? I know you referenced the crisis response to what we're looking at in September, and I know that is a separate process to area planning at the strategic level. Has there been a failure at strategic level to plan for the number of places in the special educational needs sector?
So I think, Chair, you have to look at the predicted demographics and the actual demographics. So all the NISRA predictions prior to COVID, nothing envisaged the spike in the places for special educational needs. So from my perspective, I'm unsure how the department or other planning authorities could have planned for a spike that wasn't predicted and wasn't in the NISRA statistics. So we have to recognise that, and we have to get on the front foot now in terms of dealing with what was an unexpected spike in the need for special educational places and a dramatic rise. The profile of our children is changing. We've got revised demographics now, and we are clear on a predicted rise every year up to 2032. So the key question to me is not what happened, but how are we getting now on the front foot? And we've taken a number of steps in that regard. A joint departmental and education authority task force has been set up to deal with the issue of emergency placements for September 2024. That work is ongoing. We're trying to make sure that that's joined up between the department and the education authority. We've also been engaging directly with schools. The permanent secretary wrote to all schools around whether they'd be willing to set up specialist provisions in mainstreams. The response from our schools is absolutely fantastic and overwhelming, and over 200 schools have said they would be willing to set up specialist provisions for this September. That's a tremendous response. And we're working together with colleagues in the Education Authority to respond appropriately to that. Last week the Minister made a statement on send capital, and I think he referred to that as a step change in planning, and I think absolutely that is the case. Previously, our planning for special educational needs, our capital planning, had been part of our wider processes. For example, special schools might have been included in an announcement about major works. They might have been included within the school enhancement programme, which is our extension and refurbishment programme. There was no bespoke, specific programme looking at how do we support the needs of our children. And that new programme has a twofold purpose. First of all, it wants to make sure we've got really good, high-quality accommodation for children with special educational needs. We only have to look across the special schools estate and see that the accommodation is not fit for purpose, and it's not good enough in many cases. So it has that, but it also needs to plan for growth in a managed way. So as part of that programme, the Education Authority have been asked to review all the special schools and look at the number of extensions that might be required over the next 10 years, and for those to be brought into the school enhancement programme. We're looking at up to 8 new special schools. In terms of, you'd asked previously as well about the agility of our processes and how they're moving. So rather than waiting for a development proposal for a new school to be approved, we've moved to a phase where we're allowing capital planning to progress in parallel with that process. And for example, planning will now begin for a second new special school in Belfast. So there's a real sea change there in terms of a strategic approach to capital investment going forward, which will underpin a more strategic approach to meeting children's needs going forward. So look, it's twofold. We've had a spike. It wasn't predicted. We've got to get to grips with that. We've got to make sure that our children are placed for September. And we've got to get ourselves on a more strategic front foot around planning, and we've taken decisive steps to do that.
And look, I think the Minister's announcement around that capital programme was welcomed by all parties across the chamber. I hope the next time we're discussing this that we're speaking with a department that is on the front foot on special educational needs provision, because it's not felt like that. And I think it's important, it's not felt like that for a number of years. This is not just in the last 12 months that we've had an issue with lack of places. But I'll finish there, Deputy Chair.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Just on the sustainable schools policy and the 6 criteria that are used, Are each of those criteria given equal weight?
They are, Mr. Sheehan. In fact, the policy would describe it, they're not to be viewed in a mechanistic way. No one criteria is put above the other, and they're all considered in the same way with equal weighting.
Has there ever been a situation where a school was meeting its enrolment trends and the enrolment threshold, but was falling down on some of the other criteria? Has there ever been a situation where a school like that was earmarked for closure?
Not that I can recall of, no.
You see, that suggests to me that actually enrolment trends are given more weight than the other criteria, and that's an argument we're hearing from small rural schools in particular.
I think you have to draw a distinction. If there's a school with sustainable enrolments, you've got to think, where would those children be educated other than this school? And surely the emphasis has to always then be in support and intervention. So, for example, we would have schools where the quality of educational provision has been found to need external support to improve through the inspection process. And those schools are placed in the formal intervention process and given targeted external support to improve, because there's a need for the school, there's enrolments there, and we need to support the school for the provision to improve for the children in those cases.
I understand that, Suzanne, and I'm also all for providing support for schools if they're falling down, whether it's poor leadership and management within the school or poor financial management or whatever. But it just seems, and I'm just going to finish on this point, the perception from a lot of schools who have been earmarked for closure or who are facing the threat of closure or who feel they're under pressure because their enrolment figures are dropping, that is the one issue that gets the greatest weight. So I'm just flagging that up with you. I want to talk to you, Eamon, about normalisation and that process.
Yes.
And you said in your contribution that it can be done without a DP being in place. So who makes that decision?
Well, the normalisation was an initiative that actually was initiated by the former Minister, now Lord Weir. It was a pilot, Mr. Sheen, where the objective of the pilot was to determine which was the appropriate legislative pathway for our schools number with a consistent pattern of high enrolments, how that could be normalised. The two pieces of legislation is the 1986 order and the 97 order. Okay.
I'm sorry, Eamon, is it the department who makes the decision or is it the managing authority?
I mean, it might be helpful to say something just about how the schools were identified for the pilot.
The criteria was set by the Minister, in other words, to identify the schools that would lend themselves likely to be included in for the pilot. And that criteria then the department wrote out to schools and did a matching exercise to see which schools would fit in to be included in with the pilot. There was significant engagement then with managing authorities and schools in the wide area to see whether or not they wanted to participate in the process, and then feedback in the department what were their views, should they be normalised or not. And then identifying which appropriate legislative pathway, the 86 order and 97 order, then a recommendation was made to the Minister, and it was the Minister who decided whether or not the schools were normalised or not.
So, Pat, there was a very specific set of criteria. Schools have had to have temporary variations in place for a number of years to be eligible for that programme. So it was a specific programme with specific criteria for participation in it.
Well, I understand that, and the reason I'm raising it is because I visited one school last week, and you're familiar with it, Eamon, Dean McGurk and Carrickmore, and they have had temporary variations for the past 7 years. I mean, for the past 5 years, their approved admissions were 80. In the last 5 years, it's been 98, 116, 113, 96, 113. Their projected total number of pupils by the end of the year is going to be something around 680. This is a school that was built in the 60s for 440 students. Now, I'm aware that the managing authority are opposed to the normalisation of the intake in this school. So I'm just wondering, how is this issue resolved? Does this school continue on getting temporary variations year after year after year?
Well, one way to resolve it, actually, we have consulted with both the school and the CCMS, their managing authority, and advised them the appropriate pathway now for the Dean McGurk to have his numbers normalised is via the development proposal process, which is through Article 14 of the 86 order. Because the statutory test for development proposals is two-limbed, significant change and like to have a significant impact on the wider area. And the circumstances that pertain to that particular school meets those tests. The consultation part in the 97 order is quite narrow and limited, just consultation with the school and the managing authority. Whereas the consultation process underneath the 86 order is more extensive and more far-reaching and wide-ranging. So for such a significant change, it'd be more appropriate to have such a consultation on that aspect rather than the one that's provided underneath the 97 order.
Would it not be much simpler?
A bit of time on this, but
I'll just finish off here. You know,
not all schools were normalised underneath the initiative. There were a number of schools that weren't normalised.
Yeah, no, and I understand that, but I mean, I'm just saying, if the managing authority is opposed to a DP in the first place, but the school wants their enrolment normalised.
Well, as I understand, Machine, is that the CCMS had concerns about the normalisation process in general. I'm not too sure if they're actually against bringing forward a proposal for the Dean McGurk College.
I think in all the cases of the schools where there were wider area planning considerations, it was considered appropriate to ensure that there was full consultation with all the schools in the wider area, that schools in that situation would proceed through the development proposal process. For other schools that had temporary variations, it had limited impact. Normalising them at that new admissions number had very limited impact on any other school in the area, and we were able to use this mechanism to normalise their enrolments. In the case of the Dean McGurk College and a range of other schools, there are wider considerations that we feel it would be more appropriate for them to get a full and proper consideration through the development proposal process. And I think our job is to be fair and equitable to all schools in an area and make sure that the issues are thoroughly and properly considered and the public consultation where necessary is held. So
can I just make this last point? I'm just looking clarity on this, that's all. I'm not trying to make an argument. This is the argument between a DP and normalisation. Could a minister just say, I'm going to normalise the intake here? In this, in any school, I'm not specifically referring to Dean McGurk. Could a minister override the process of a DP and say, I'm going to normalise the enrolment, the admissions?
That was a specific process that had a pilot, that had very clear terms of reference, that had criteria, that was a robust analysis.
It doesn't exist outside of that pilot, the normalisation process?
No.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here today. I just wanted to touch on, again, I'm based up in the Northwest and represent what is a fairly rural constituency. I just wanted to bring up, it'll probably be yourself, Eamon, the issue of Ballogry School, just outside Derry, the primary school. I spoke recently with Mr. O'Kane. He's quite a young, dynamic, energetic principal there. And we had a good conversation about deep-rooted concern just for the sort of policies around what is a sustainable school and how does it look. I've been down at that school. It's incredible. There's a real sense of community. I just want to know, do you feel the current method to define sustainable versus non-sustainable is suitable? Our education is ever changing, and I know there can be a number of challenges, but do you feel the policy around this is fair?
Well, it's the policy that we have. It was set back in 2009 in terms of the Sustainable Schools policy. And what we have done is, and maybe Lorraine can talk to this slide because she was a part of it, we've tried to bring the policy up to current context and circumstances of which all schools would operate. In fact, we developed what was called a user guide to try and reflect that a school's circumstances were now managing authorities and boards of governors could actually view the current context of their school in an up-to-date way, in a modern way, that the policy, because it was drafted when it was, that would be more in line with the current circumstances that would take account of local circumstances of the school and where it exists. Maybe, Lorraine, if you want to...
At the final year of the first area plan, the first 5-year area plan, we did a piece of work around barriers to effective area planning, and we looked at, what's working well, what's not working so well, and one of the issues that was raised was that schools didn't really know what was going on with the sustainable schools policy, given that there had been some changes. So as Eamon said, we prepared a user guide February 2022, and that was issued to all schools, and basically it ran through the policy and told schools how they should be using the policy and how they could, what they should be doing in terms of keeping on top of any sustainability trends that were emerging in their school, and what they should do and who they should contact to help them to either overcome the problems, to look for solutions that might lead to more sustainable provision in an area. So we are very conscious that area planning has to keep up with the changes in society and also in the changes in legislation. And we've recently just obviously had a major change in terms of the Integrated Education Act, and everything has been looked at and revised again, and that user guide will be updated in terms of the Integrated Education Act and other things that have happened since in terms.
So, see, with that user guide then, will that essentially enable schools who maybe are seeing a fall in enrolment, will that enable them to have essentially a turnaround time to, try and garner more support locally or get more pupils coming in? I'm just mindful certain schools have challenges over the years. Maybe they have a large number of principals and turnover, and maybe they just need that little bit of time, turnaround time, to essentially up enrolment and get the word out there. Is that
in the user guide, there is a Board of Governors checklist that governors can look at, and if they identify any specific issues, they can get in touch with their managing authority. The whole point is not to wait until it's crisis mode. You're in crisis mode. It is actually to keep an eye on it as things progresses and watch the trends. Just don't arrive at a position where there is no alternative. So it's to encourage schools to engage not only with their managing authority but also with other schools in their area, because local solutions can be worked through and can be brought forward.
The school that I've mentioned there had touched on the fact that they would need 105 pupils to be deemed sustainable, but oftentimes more urban settings are around the number of about 135. Do you think that's fair?
Well, at the time when those numbers were as devised in the policy, there's a rationale behind the policy or the numbers being set. The optimum number for a school, a primary school, would be 210, 7 classes of 30. So therefore, that was taken and then applied well, but not all schools are the same across Northern Ireland between urban and rural, and that's why there is a difference between the 105 and the 140. So there's allowances made as per the policy as to, it's just not an arbitrary figure of 210. Urban is 140 and rural is 105.
I think Cara will have to be also open and transparent about the potential impact that low enrolments can have on children. The policy is clear about that, and I just think about, for example, in a post-primary environment, if enrolments are low, that has an impact on funding, because we fund schools essentially on the basis of per pupil funding, okay? So if the funding's low, that has a knock-on effect then on the number of specialist teachers that a school can employ, and that in turn has a huge impact on the curriculum. We have the entitlement framework where all children should have access to 21 subjects. That's very difficult to deliver when you don't have sufficient specialist teachers, you don't have sufficient funding. So as Lorraine said, it is about early intervention, but we also do have to be mindful that when enrolments reach a certain level, it can have a significant detrimental impact on the educational experience of our children. And at primary level, you would see, for example, the impact perhaps of composite classes, which is not ideal in a teaching and learning environment in very small schools. So I think we do want to be looking at early intervention and making sure that schools aren't getting to a stage where they're going down and down and down. At the same time, we always have to be mindful that children, they only have one opportunity. At school, they have only 7 years, and we have to be mindful that that child has to have the highest quality educational experience that we can possibly offer them. So we do need to be clear, there are issues that enrolments lead to in our schools.
We're also out of time. Maybe other members can pick this up. I mean, I would just want to, I mean, is this policy not due a review? That would be,
2009 is crazy, given
just,
that we're facing such
the policy was due
demographics.
to be reviewed, but the Assembly decided that they would commission the, or not the Assembly, the Executive Commission, the independent review. So it was put on hold. So we were actually on the brink of reviewing the policy.
I would hope, given that that was maybe the direction of travel departmentally, that's very clear from the independent review, the policy needs review, that's where we'll land. Because it seems like there are...
I think that's something that can be picked
comes
up in the
across
wider ministerial response to the review.
Thank you.
Annie?
Thank you, Chair. Is Annie going to respectfully disagree with saying the speak that we didn't see it coming? Back in 2018, I was talking to community and voluntary groups who said a tsunami was coming when it came to special educational needs and particularly school placements. And there's a number of reports sitting there from Children's Commissioners, Children's Law Centre, that are a decade old with recommendations that have never been followed through on. I suppose this will bring me into in the placements and enrolment. It is nice to sit in here that 99.9% of the children in primary are placed but for
primary.
Yeah, but 600 children probably now, the latest numbers, still don't have a placement who have special educational needs. Here's my ask. Can we not change how we do this? Can we not place children with special educational needs first, so they are not coming in waiting to September, October, November without a place?
Yes, Danny, that is something that the department's looking at as part of the wider end-to-end review of school improvement. The same policy officials within the department are responsible for that, and they could talk to you a little bit more about that process. Certainly, it is a matter of concern that children are not placed and there's not placements available, and we are working extremely hard to put those places into the system for September 2024. I think in terms of the point that you raise about recommendations around special educational needs, you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of reports that have provided a lot of recommendations on how we can do things better. My point was specifically in reference to the population spike and the NISRA statistics around that, which weren't predicted. But we have seen for a long time that there's a changing profile of our children, and we've a lot of data and information about how we can do things better. The department has moved with the end-to-end review of special educational needs to look at everything to do with the policies and processes around SEN, because there's a lot of things that we can do better and make sure we get them right. You're absolutely spot on.
And that would fall into then supernumerary as well. I'm talking about enrolment. Like, we're leaving children outside of the enrolment as well. And that sort of leads me into like another question around the policy for sustainable schools, and special schools aren't a part of that. And the elements of that policy, where does that fit into when we're talking about SPIMS then?
Well, firstly, sustainable schools policy is not applicable though to special schools. We would much rather have the policy of inclusion that can guide us as to how special schools are managed. And that.
We have an inclusion policy?
Well, that would be that's the part of what's going to be the outworkings of the end-to-end review. That's all underneath.
We have a
review.
general approach of inclusion first and mainstream first, but Lorraine can say a little bit more about the interaction between specialist provisions and the establishment of specialist provisions and the sustainable schools framework. I just wanted to pick up one wee point though before she does around the supernumerary, and I suppose it's just to say one of the changes, while children are supernumerary for admissions processes, statement of children with SEN, we have changed our processes around capital, and those children are now included in the school enrolment for capital. So no longer would we have a case where school might have an enrolment of 770 statement of children and be built for 700. It's now built for the number of children that are there.
Would they be included then if, say, I'm going to give an example of St Mary's in 5 Mile Town. We had that briefing and it was highlighted in it when they were reaching out to give provision within the school for special educational needs, and then supernumerary was raised, and the fact that not them children wouldn't have been counted as part of their numbers for sustainability.
One of the things we're doing is we're looking at a case by case in terms of accommodation analysis and what schools have in terms of their accommodation and what they need vis-a-vis their enrolment. I have to be honest and open with you, we don't have the funding to put all the additional accommodation across every school in the country to bring them up to the level of accommodation they would have for all, but we're doing it on a case by case basis. So if there is a school that you're aware of and there's an accommodation deficiency due to a large number of supernumerary children, we'd be more than happy to have a look at that school.
You see my point about the enrolment though of it, if children aren't counted as part of their numbers, and then they're saying that the sustainability of the school is because the numbers are dropping, but yet you're not including children with special educational needs.
We look at actual.
We look at actual.
We look at actual numbers.
Yeah.
When they're not counted for admissions purposes, but we actually look at when we're looking at the sustainability of school, we look at the numbers with SEN, children with SEN, and the numbers without. So the two figures are looked at. So, and in terms
There seems to be a bit of a like when you're, and it's not just that's just happened to be the briefing, but I'm getting this a lot as well from within my own constituency, and a lot of principals will tell you that there's frustration there with the supernumerary and all of that when it comes to not just enrolment, but then how they go forward with it, and the lack of probably information flowing back and forth from the Education Authority and then yourselves. So there is definitely something that needs to be looked at within that.
And do you want to say something just about, just conscious of your questions about the SPIMS and sustainability?
Briefly here, and then we'll move on to the next question.
in terms of SPIMS and sustainability, what we request the EA to do is to make sure that when they're putting in classes into mainstream schools, that the schools are sustainable and that they're providing high quality education, because we do not want SPIMS being set up in schools that are not, they're going to be, closed in a matter of years. So all the drive is towards sustainable schools. However, there is enough room in the enough wriggle room, and I use that, I don't use that lightly, to allow schools, if there is an absolute need in an area, to allow the Education Authority to put a SPIMS class in. But again, it has to have high quality. It has to be high quality provision.
Yeah, it's a flexible. The framework is able to flex where there's
absolute need. And the whole point of the approach now with SPIMS is to allow for that agility, so that they're not tied up with the development proposal process, that they're able to go on an annual basis wherever the demand is. It's.
I've drawn a line on that at that one, so thank you. And Cheryl, you're in next.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the update so far. Within the report, there is a strong emphasis on the Board of Governors, and we always speak about Board of Governors. But it's just asking, would you have any information about the vacancies throughout Northern Ireland in terms of Board of Governors within schools?
Yeah, we wouldn't have that to hand just now, but we can get that and provide that back in writing to the committee.
Yeah, it's just even from obviously like a local perspective, what we're seeing that there's vacancies there, and is that disproportionately affected within areas of social and economic deprivation? Going through that process, I know people are maybe struggling to get people within those communities to come on boards, which means their voices aren't being heard. So it's just the emphasis in this report on the Board of Governors. It would be making that process more accessible and more inclusive to make sure that everybody's fully represented within those.
Absolutely, and there are, of course, additional challenges in attracting boards of governors in areas of social and economic disadvantage. It can be difficult in other circumstances too, perhaps in a rural area, perhaps with a small school. There's a range of challenges that schools can face in recruiting boards of governors with the right experience and expertise to ensure that they can do their job efficiently and effectively. It's not our area within the department, so in terms of more detail, happy to write back to the committee around the boards of governors.
Yeah, no, that would be appreciated, thank you. And just the quick one, in terms of the relationship between health and education, and obviously the policies moving forward, how are you finding that relationship working?
So as part of the placements, there's very close working between health and education. Again, apologies, but it's not our specific remit around that particular area. So again, if you would like more detail on the relationship between health and education, we can provide that in writing. Suffice to say, there is very close working in terms of both SEN placements and the end-to-end review of SEN health represented on the appropriate groups in both those cases.
And in terms of the planning and the development, moving forward, are you getting the right data and the information from health to make those decisions?
Again, I'd say in terms of health data, there are issues there in terms of us getting all the right and transparent data about children, okay, and making sure that they're known to the system in a timely manner. And again, I say the end-to-end review of SEN, it is looking at that, and it is looking at early identification of data around children. So again, I'm afraid other colleagues would be able to give you a more fulsome briefing in that regard. Apologies.
No, I'm asking awkward questions.
No,
I think the data piece around health is a key issue with planning. So if we don't have the data, how can you make the informed decisions, moving forward? So it is something I think we should.
Absolutely agree. I think if we're talking about where we might need a new special school or where a SPIM should go in, but we don't understand what the workforce capacity is in health for a speech and language therapist or an OT, it feels there's a big disconnect there in the process, and the idea that area planning would exist in a vacuum without health is quite a bit concerning, I think.
No, it's not that area planning in any way is working in a vacuum without health. I thought you're specifically talking about placements and identification of children. But of course, health have a key input to all our policies and processes. But for example, in terms of planning for new special school provision, colleagues in the Education Authority are responsible for looking at the number of places that would be required in terms of a special school and working out the long-term need there, and in working closely with health around the services and support.
Robin? Okay, I wasn't going to go down that line, but I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. This is something that me and Pat, particularly Pat, but I'm on board with Pat with regard to developing that conversation. Is the Ministerial and Departmental Directive, having written out to over 200 schools for SPIMs, is that part of area planning, or is that seen as area planning long term? Is it seen as a reaction to the need at the moment? Because the question that's been raised, and Pat has made this point repeatedly, is that we have a finite number of speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, and it's okay if we get these SPIMs opened across all these schools. Where does the workforce come to support that? And if it's not area planning, fine. However,
no, it's not. It's not area planning. Establishment of SPIMs in the short term isn't. But just to comment on,
it isn't. If they're going to do them in the long term, as a departmental strategy, it then becomes area planning.
SPIMs are an important part of educational provision in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
There's long been small classes within schools in Northern Ireland, whether they've been designated as units, learning support centres, specialist provisions. Okay. They have a really important role in terms of providing small group support and in facilitating inclusion for children as well, because the whole point of the specialist provision is that the child gets the small group support that they require within the SPIM class, but that there's opportunities for integration throughout the curriculum with the other children in the mainstream school. So SPIMs are part of the landscape. They continue to be part of the landscape. We need emergency provisions. We have a crisis for September 2024 in terms of placements. We are responding to meet that, and we need to set up specialist provisions as a matter of urgency. The department wrote to all schools, and just to clarify that point, over 200 have come back to say they would be able to establish specialist provisions for September. Of course, in setting up specialist provisions, we have to look closely at service provision, and that includes the services from health around speech and language and all of that, and how those services are provided. It also includes how it's staffed, how it's resourced. For example, one of the things we've done is we've provided a £20,000 capital grant to provide resources and equipment for every new specialist provision that's going to open. So we're very aware that there's a wraparound piece there. They're not just a short-term solution, they are a longer-term solution. They have an important role to play in the education system.
I'm going to follow up again because I've got a question.
Absolutely.
And it's thank you.
Follow up.
This one here is slightly different than the angle we've been taking so far, but it goes down. I think it was, again, stealing Pat's thunder here. We're on the same page here. So the independent review picked up a piece where it talks about A-levels becoming probably the most important terminal exam that pupils will do. So, and it's asking us to look at the GCSE and the value and so on. And part of area planning, I imagine, and the applications will be schools looking for increased post-16 or to have post-16 facility that they maybe didn't have. And there's a big change since Minister Ruan wrote the initial sort of piece till now, and we've got more people staying in education longer. In terms of just explaining to me, in terms of a school that makes application, but the controlling body says no and says, we're not going to put this forward to operational stage 2, whatever it's called. Do the department have oversight of that? And can the department then overrule if they deem it that the school did meet the criteria? And if you could tell me what the criteria is. And there's a school particularly I'm thinking of here in Portadown,
Yes.
St John the Baptist. So
At that school 2 days ago.
good man, you're gonna make a decision.
No, I know the school that you're referring to. That school wants to introduce post-16, okay, and it's been through a pathway of already introducing Key Stage 4 already and that came through the development process. It's a maintained school and it's managing authority, CCMS. It has to work with its managing authority and vice versa, and managing authority work with the school to bring forward such a proposal if that's what the intent is. But in the area planning sphere, it has to look at, in doing that, look at the wider area and implication, whether or not there's a need not only in that school, but how does that have an impact on the wider area. And that's where the role of the managing authority comes in with the school, is looking at that, not just in the school in isolation, but the wider area. So that will be a matter, Mr. Butler, between the school and the managing authority, CCMS. The department has to be careful. It can't ride roughshod over both the school or both the managing authority. It has to be respectful, because managing authorities and schools, depending on their nature, they're the area planners, not necessarily the department, because we have to keep the purview of the department for the analysis of such proposals objectively, and then provide a submission to the minister advising them about what course of action he should take with such a proposal. And it wouldn't be appropriate almost for the department to make an intervention in that and say, well, no, bring one forward or not to.
Is there a criteria?
For
entitlement framework.
Yes.
Entitlement framework is where you get the criteria, and if the school feels they've met then they
have to be able to deliver 21 courses
yes.
For the pupils, and it has to be a coherent bunch of 21 courses so the children can follow a worthwhile pathway.
And it also has to be delivered in such a way that it's sustainable. So what we would see, for example, with smaller schools, with small sixth forms, is that while they may be compliant with the entitlement framework on paper, they don't actually deliver the 21 schools or 21 subjects, apologies. The other thing we would see is a lot of classes with below 10 pupils, which in turn creates, because they're trying to give pupils the choice, and they've small classes below 10 pupils, which is the break-even point really for post-16 classes, and therefore that then puts a significant strain on the school's finances. So in terms of post-16, there's wider and significant strategic issues about...
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, that, the 21 subject choice seems kind of ridiculous when we're looking at burdening young people with doing maybe 10 GCSEs and maybe having to pick 4 A levels, and I think the independent review picks something like that up. I mean,
that's a choice. That's not that they're doing those subjects. It's a choice to ensure that they have a broad and balanced curricular choice.
The fact that the school has to have a suite of 21 subjects has that been reviewed?
That's the law, and it has been reviewed. It was actually reduced by a previous minister from 27 and 24 subjects to 21. But you have to think about those children as well and their right to a broad and balanced choice. So what is an appropriate pathway for one child in a school is not an appropriate pathway for another. And if there's limited choice, children are all bunched into the same pathway that isn't the right and appropriate pathway for that child and may not give them appropriate progression to the next level. So we have to be really careful. I mean, limiting choice is not good for children.
Limiting framework is probably a whole other conversation for another time. And I mean, I have had I've had interactions with schools who have had multiple issues around navigating the entitlement framework. It is not straightforward. But I'm going to bring it to a close there. I think that's been a really helpful session, but I think my takeaway is we've got a very out-of-date policy that is governing these decisions, and I think I think the committee will be interested to see how the recommendations from the independent review progress in this area. So, well, we will leave it there, but thank you all
Chair.
for your time.
Thank you.
Out. So while officials are leaving, would it be worth just quickly recapping on any actions arising from our 2 departmental briefings? Or we can bring that forward in a note for next week if that is more helpful.
Thanks so much. Yes, Chair, I think there were a couple of things that we wanted to write back to the department just to follow up. In the last session, some were kind of outside the remit of this panel of witnesses. So Cheryl's question about the boards of governors, guidance on accessibility and inclusivity of boards of governors, particularly in areas of economic disadvantage. They're going to provide that in writing. An assessment of the relationship between health and education, and particularly in respect of data. And I think that we may have asked that question already, so obviously we'll not, if we've got the response in, we'll not ask it again. Robbie, did you want to go over any more of that A-level material at the end, or?
I can look at that. I can look at that myself if it's fine. I know where to look. That's okay. Thank you.
Okay. The witnesses then, sorry, in the integrated education session, they didn't seem to give an example of when the new statutory duty impacted on decision making. So that may be something that you want to follow up in writing, members. There was something that members wanted about the development proposal decision making timelines. So, and particularly in respect of outstanding decisions, what the envisaged timeline for those is. That's what I have noted, Chair. That do you have?
I'm happy with all of that. Is there anything else any other members wanted to raise that we'd agreed on?
Covered.
No, happy with that. Okay. That's grand. Well, that moves us on to item 10 on the agenda, which is correspondence, and not as much correspondence as in some other weeks, so we should be able to move through this fairly rapidly. So I just refer members to pages 139 to 202 of your packs, and I'll just run through any that may require a decision from the committee. Otherwise, it will be as per the summary note at page 139. So item 10.4, page 159, it's a response from the department in relation to the regulation of the childcare sector, including adult-child ratios for child members. Are members content that we forward that response to Unite, who raised the issues with the committee? Is that agreed?
Yep, agreed.
Item 10.5, response from the Minister of Health regarding the recommendations that we heard from Diverse Youth NI. The committee has written to a number of departments on that issue. Are members content to hold that correspondence but commit to sharing all of the responses with Diverse NI once received? Are we agreed?
Great.
Item 10.8, page 178, it's the investing activity report for the Department of Education, April 2024. I'd like to suggest that we ask Raise to provide some analysis of that investment activity. There's not a lot of detail in that report. It would be good to get a bit more. Are members agreed? Item 10.9, page 197, correspondence from the Children's Law Centre, and it was specifically thanking the committee for making Aurelia's visit to Parliament Buildings such a success last week. And I think certainly, I think some members may have left who were able to meet with Aurelia, but for everyone who was here was there. I think it was a great opportunity for Aurelia, but a great opportunity for us to meet her and her family. And she had a lot to say on the issues around inclusion in the education system, and it was an absolute pleasure to be able to host her. And just thank Robbie for his initial proposal to invite Aurelia to Parliament Buildings. So just on the back of that, I would just want to propose that we do write back to the Children's Law Centre and thank them for facilitating the visit and to pass on our thanks to Aurelia and her family. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Item 10.10, page 198, correspondence from the British Association of Social Workers in Northern Ireland outlining their views in relation to the draft statutory guidance on the reduction and management of restrictive practices in educational settings in Northern Ireland. Members will certainly want to consider that briefing for next week's meeting, as we are covering restraint and seclusion. I think we may be probably too tight to be getting another briefing in at this stage, but I'm certainly happy if after next week's session there is an appetite to invite them for a briefing at another stage. Happy to consider that at that stage. Are members content to deal with the correspondence along those lines? And then other than that, I propose we dispose of the other correspondence received as per the summary note at page 100. 339. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
That's great. That takes us to item 11, which is a forward work programme. And I would just refer you to page 211 of your pack. I would like to propose that we have a more detailed correspondence on the forward work plan next week, because there is a further paper to be tabled in relation to the terms of reference of the RSA inquiry, the call for evidence on that, and summary of any other actions arising from the strategic planning session. So are members content that we hold a more detailed conversation next week on that, when we should have time in the agenda? The only exception I would add to that, and I might just ask for the clerk and her team to maybe assist with this, I think we have received quite a number of written briefings over the last while in relation to restraint and seclusion specifically, and I think it may be helpful just to have all of those provided to members in one place in advance of next week's session, so that we have all of that material, because I think it is important that we are aware of the detail around that issue. Are members agreed that we receive that those written briefings in advance of next week? And that is fine, other than just to agree that the draft forward work programme as it currently stands to be reviewed next week. Members agreed? That takes us to item 12, any other business?
You're not going to explain the egg and spoon?
Okay, well, we should reference there is a proposal that we conduct an egg and spoon race towards the end of the of our mandate here. Maybe the clerk would like to speak to that.
There was just an idea at the strategic planning about an outdoor exercise and a theme of that, and you're having sports stakeholders, and why not?
To be clear, the egg and spoon race was not my proposal, but members are happy to consider it and reflect on that for next week. So if the egg and spoon race is the only other item of business, that just moves us on to item 13, which is the date, time and place of the next meeting, and that'll be Wednesday the 15th of May, 2 p.m, room 29, Parliament Buildings. So that just leaves me to put the question that the committee meeting does now adjourn.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Committee room 29. Sound. Committee room 29. Sound. Committee room 29. Sound.